Welcome to episode 43 of the Coast Coast AFL podcast with Nick and Blaze. This week we are continuing our preseason team analysis breakdowns. We are covering Essendon, Geelong, Gold Coast, and Fremantle this week, and we're ready to pretty much get stuck straight into it. So how are you doing, Mr. Psyrick?
Too bad, not too bad. Sort of just gone out a few times this week. It's Fringe Festival over in Perth, so saw a few shows and just, sort of chilling. It's the weekend as we're recording this. I'm going house sitting next week, so I thought we'd get the recording out of the way. So this is the first time in AFL Coast to Coast history you are listening to us record on the weekend. Probably. I don't think there's a good one.
Yes, I think this is the first time. Which is
So
it feels
who knows?
It feels weird to do this early than what we normally do.
Yeah, I know, but it's like, we only record on Mondays, so because it's right after the football, so yeah.
Yeah, it's always
Nice bit
kind
about the
of always just
preseason.
kind of worked out that way. It's just made it so much better.
Yeah, it can be flexible.
Yeah.
To be talking, how is yours? How is your start of the weekend going well, Blaze?
It's not been too bad. I've got a 4-day weekend because we didn't work yesterday.
Nice.
But I just don't really have much to do. I'm probably just gonna stream for most of it. Even though I'd like to go out, like
Yeah.
I'd like to go do something fun, but like everyone else is busy, so I'll probably just
Yeah.
end up doing a bunch of streaming or something. I'm not sure yet.
Still cool. Chilling with your mates online.
Yeah,
Always
pretty much.
nice.
I mean, I can't really afford to travel right now, so I can't even go and see them. Because this is the weekend I'm normally like up in Brisbane, and I was gonna come to Perth this weekend, but I just can't currently afford it. So
Yeah.
just better to just chill and play games at home, probably.
Fair cop.
All right, shall we get stuck straight into it?
Yes. Before we start, I'd just like to note on a few things that have changed.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I've put all the 2024 stuff before the list changes. Hopefully, with our internets being a bit more in sync, we tinker with a few things. So hopefully, this episode goes well for you. But we are, of course, starting with the big one. Very, I wouldn't say controversial, but a lot of talk about them. The Essendon Bombers in 2024. We'll be interested to see how they go this year. But in terms of what happened in 2024, it was a fast start by the Bombers. No one was quite expecting it. Young team. I think I predicted them near the bottom. But they were keen and eager. They had the easy draw, but they still nabbed wins against Hawthorn, the Doggies, the Giants, and had that draw against Collingwood and Freo as they went to get a 8-1-4 record to their bye. I think their draw against Freo was after.
Yep.
But the only terrible loss being to Port Adelaide in round 4. I'm sorry, they didn't draw with Freo. I'm thinking of Collingwood. I read Collingwood and my mind went to them. So
no, that's good.
Yeah. They had that terrible loss in round 4 where they just couldn't get hands on the ball. Bit of concern with the midfield, but they did bounce back from that. In the first half of the season, it was mainly Stringer and Langford providing most of their goals, as you can see in the right-hand column, and they benefit from the best season start in his probable career. Probably the best season start in his career. He's definitely not had a probable career. It's a certified legend, Zach Merritt. Cornerstone of that Essendon midfield, had an absolutely fantastic start for the season, but depending on which media pundits you're asking, some were thinking they were going to win the premiership. Others were saying, well, you haven't quite beaten some good teams. We don't really expect you to keep on. I thought they would drop off a bit, but stay in the 8. Unfortunately, they finished 3-7 to end up the year. 2 wins out of 8, and a very symmetrical... to end up 2 wins out of the 8, I should say.
Oh, yeah.
And ended with very symmetrical 11, 1, and 11, with the 4th lowest percentage in the lead at 93.84.
There was
a very awkward.
Speaking of percentage, there was a big meme that we were talking about for ages that there were. I think it was like out of 14 or 15 teams, they were like the only. Oh, actually, it wasn't probably like 15, but it was like 12, 13 teams. They were always Like, even when they were in the top 8, they were always the one with the lowest percentage out of, like,
Yeah.
13, 14 teams.
Well, they racked up the lowest percentage for a top 2 ladder position in the lead.
They did.
Because obviously it's very hard to get it in like round 1 or 2 if you're like, got a very low percentage. So you have to actually win enough, but you also have to win by not much. So I think the only contender in recent history was North Melbourne when they had a fairly easy run. I think they were like, I think it was something like 9-1, but with a percentage of just under or just around 100. So, yeah.
Fair enough.
So anyway, it was a very awkward position. Had enough experience on the list to say that they may have been a bit stronger after the good start, to at least make that finals. But on the flip side, probably should be encouraged by a lot of young talent coming in and improving in the absence of the players that underperformed or injured in this year. Obviously, they had a lot of injuries in their back line, and as we jump to the stats overview of 2024, I think you can see that is sort of reflected by all the red in there. Unfortunately, I must admit, I try to find some positives in each line, but yeah, for Essendon's defense, it was very much hard to do that for. But we won't start there. We'll start with the goals. Offense. And they finished 12th. 13th for goals scored with an average of 12. And their inside 50 count was 55.7, which ended up being 4th. So what that sort of tells you is that they were good at getting the ball inside 50, but they weren't very good at converting.
Couldn't do anything about it.
And yeah, pretty much you see these stats under that. The opponent could rebound out of their forward 50 at 77.5% of the time. Oh, sorry, no. I think that's the opposite way around. I think that's 20 whatever percent of the time. Goals per inside 50, 21.5, 17th in the competition. Set shot per inside 50, 40.4%, 16th in the competition. Scores per inside 50, 43.9, 15th in the competition. Offensive one-on-one win percent, 25.4, 13th in the competition. But to be fair, they didn't actually target too many players one-on-one. 9.9 per game, which is 14th in the competition. Scores from centre clearance, though, were really good. They generated a lot from the middle. They were 4th in the league with 13 points per game. And their tackle inside 50 count was 11.3 at 5th in the game. So they obviously couldn't quite hit the targets that they wanted inside 50. But they did at least provide enough pressure to generate at least something from the high amount of inside 50s. I know it's not much, but they definitely didn't get it that conventionally. And yeah, if you go on the opposite side in defense, this is sort of where the sadness comes in. Goals against, 13 against, 15th in the league. Defensive one-on-one losses, 32.1, tied 18th in the lead. Defensive one-on-ones, 5th in the league. So they were targeted for a lot of one-on-one contests, and they lost. A lot of these one-on-one contests, normally they come from intercept plays. As you can see, the opposition have a high score off turnover. So normally you see it, there's a one-on-one contest, but a player's like leapt out the back, gone ahead, and scores an easy goal. So it's not saying that their bodies aren't good enough. Might say they're slow, but it also has to do with turnovers as well. But it wasn't just that. Opposition score from defensive half, 15th at 35 points per game. Opposition score from centre bounce, 13.1, which is a tiny bit more than what they generated themselves. 16th in the league. Opposition score off turnovers, we mentioned that, 50.4 at 15th. They were the second last in spoils with 28 per game. Defensive pressure acts, very mid, 134.3 at 12. Opposition goals per inside 50, 25.8%, 15th in the league. Opposition set shots per inside 50, 46.2, and opposition score per inside 50, 49.2, all at 15th. And that just says, like, as much as Essendon controlled the ball, it was much easier to score against them at a higher rate of what Essendon were looking to score.
Yep.
Sort of reflected in their percentage as well. And, there's a bit of the meme about the Essendon Edge. I sort of referred to it in my little preview slide. But if we view an edge as a very sharp object, you draw like a line between their ball movement stats, which are up here, their offense stats, which are down here, and their defense stats that are down here. And you kind of got that edge because their middle work was really, really good for the year. They were number one in disposals, generating 383 disposals per game at first. Disposal differential was also good, so it wasn't just them winning the ball. They restrict their opponents enough. They were plus 24 in that stat and second in the league.
Mm-hmm.
Handballs, they were third in the competition at 159, but it was also complemented by a good handball efficiency at 83.8%,
Mm-hmm.
second in the league. Marks, they were high in the league at 98.9, third. Mark differential, they were also positive 5.9, I should say, and fourth, so they could move the ball around the ground. Marks on lead as well, they were fairly first in, so considering how little that they got in their offense, this was stuff in the wing as well. So this was like a ball movement sort of marks on lead differential. First in the league, 3.4. Center clearance differential, 1.1, third in the league. Inside 50 differential, a massive 5.4, which is the fifth best in the league, and an intercept differential of 2.1, which is third in the lead. But their clearances overall, they only got 14th in the lead, so they didn't really have as many stoppages per game, but they didn't do that well in them. Again, stoppage clearance differential, 1.9 loss, tied 16th in the lead. Their meters to disposal, not too surprising with a high handball heavy team, but still significantly low. It's the worst in the competition. 15.5 meters per disposal. Meters gain differential, obviously, 79.2 loss because, they were pretty much playing the short game, but opponents could generate more from their offense. So even though they were getting the ball inside 50 and all that, when it was going the other way, opponents could make up ground. And the ground ball gets, they were 13th in the lead at 86.9. So a few bad stats even with that, but overall, we've got a midfield unit that was providing a lot of the ball, working enough around the ground, getting that movement going. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough at both ends to really capitalize from that. So as we move on to the list changes, and Essendon just didn't really choose to patch up anything. They went straight to the draft and traded out and delisted a few players, a couple from retirements. Going for the draft, we've got Isaac Coco, the exciting small forward at pick 13 from the academy. Probably would have been in the top 10 otherwise. And then we've got Kyle Gerran, Angus Clark, Reese Unwin, Archer Day Wicks, which is from the rookie draft, Jaden Nguyen from the rookie draft, Cat P rookie, and Jackson Pryor, recruited from Brisbane as an SSP, as well as trading out Jake Stringer to GWS, retirements of Jake Kelly and Dyson Heppel in the back line, and the delisting of Kane Baldwin, Jaden Davey, Nick Hind, Jaden Hunter, Tex Wanganeen, and Sam Wiedemann. So a lot of changes, but not much experience coming in from Essendon.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, we all kind of knew that Stringer wanted to stay if he was given a bigger contract. He was looking for something more secure long term. But Essendon weren't willing to give it to him, which is why he opted to go to a different club, start fresh. GWS needed him up forward, so they took him. We'll talk about that in next week's episode.
Yes.
The delistings of Nick Hind and Sam Wiedemann specifically are very interesting to me because they're good depth players that they could have used. Actually, they probably could have still used next season purely for the fact that there is no guarantee, who's going to be able to fill in roles that are a little bit harder to do, especially from half back. Tex Wanganeen is a little rough. He's got the Wanganeen name that has a lot of history in the AFL, and it's very unfortunate that he's not really been given a proper shot at forging a career. He might get picked up somewhere down the line. Maybe he'll do something like like go back into the VFL or like the Waffle, or I can't remember where he's from, and just build up more of a repertoire before signing back up, hopefully. And then obviously Jake Kelly and Dyson Heppel. We all knew that their times were coming, especially Hep. It's
Mm.
very sad, because despite the saga that happened, like he was still an incredible player. He gave his heart and soul for Essendon. It's very unlucky that he never really got kind of the major praises that he was hoping for on field.
Yeah, a very awkward send off. Exactly. It
Yeah,
was a bit disappointing considering how bad Essendon's back half of the year was. Especially when they looked like they weren't going to make finals. So it was very disappointing to see him go that way.
yeah.
But even in terms of the quality he was producing on the field, even last year, it was still quite a big hole to fill in, and it will be for next year.
And even with like the draft signings that they've gotten, it's still going to take a long time for them to like cultivate into probably what they specifically need in their back line and in their forward line, mind you.
Yeah.
Because like as we just looked at the stats, their midfield for the most part is pretty solid. Obviously, there are some holes that they need to work on, like their clearance rate, especially. But for the most part, their midfield's really good. It's just that forward line and that back line that needs a lot of work.
Yeah, as I said, because that's not even necessarily. I should have probably specified when the movement's in the middle, like the centre bounce stuff. Anyone attending as an inside midfield, absolutely fantastic. It was just the around the ground stoppages where they couldn't convert. And considering they were a team that struggled to take marks inside 50 and all that, when it came to the forward stoppages, they were just screaming out for a player to get those. And unfortunately, Jake Stringer, as good as he was at goal kicking, he really wasn't that great at around the ground stoppages. Sure, you had to mark him to make sure he doesn't do anything, but he really wasn't providing enough. So we'll mention a bit later, but I don't think the loss of Stringer long term is a bad thing, and I reckon it would have been a bad decision to give him a bag.
Yeah, but does that
or the years?
Is it going to be better to have Langford and the other one that I'm already blanking on? Like
KK.
no. They had another forward,
It's like
2 meter Peter and someone like
2
that.
meter Peter, yeah.
And like players of that sort of caliber, is it really right for them to now take on, the number one defender, the number two defender in those positions, whereas Stringer would have most of the time had that number one defender?
Yeah, the sort of utility defender, probably medium height, got a bit of athleticism to keep up with him, and that then goes to a forward that, aren't really known for their running. You're right, they've got a bit of a lack of T-forward speed in there, so yeah, but sort of, as you can imply, we do have a bit of skepticism on some of the holes in their list.
Oh yeah, true.
But I think we can move on to the players of importance, but I agree with you entirely. It's going to be a tough forward line to try and score goals from. Which, because we're talking about the forward line, I'm actually going to start off with my fourth one, which is the combination of Jai Menzies, Ben Hobbs, and Alwyn Davey Jr. I did actually read a report that Alwyn Davey Jr. had a little injury setback in training. Let's hope it's not too long. But this is essentially the mosquito fleet for Essendon. And I know Isaac Keiko, he might play straight away. He's definitely more of an immediate pick for the Bombers. I think they'll try and incorporate him into the team as soon as he can. But what we're looking for with the Dons is replacing the 42 goals that Jake Stringer added to the side in 2024.
Yeah.
He was missing a few bits, but it's still a lot of goals. Second highest goal scorer for Essendon. And, to put some perspective, if you compare that to someone like Nick Watson last year, he scored 25 goals on debut for what was pretty unequivocally a great year. I mean, sure, he might have got a few more goals if he was accurate in the first half, but you get 25 goals from a, pretty good small forward draft pick, and you can't believe your luck, really.
Yeah, exactly right.
Especially in that small forward position. So even if he does get those 25 goals, you're still going to need nearly 20 goals made up. especially if Guelphy, who's sort of had a few niggles in the season, I don't think has been training, still had that injury from Kerry at the late of last year.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to have to find it from somewhere, and it's probably not going to be a single player. But I think the addition, I don't even think these players will play all 22 games. But that rotation just has to get enough goals to keep Essendon ticking. So I think that's very important. I know it's a 3-for-1 deal, but I think one just has to be good. Honestly, it's probably more likely to be Ben Hobbs. Though Alan David Jr. Did look good. He just needs a bit more consistency in his game.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Menzies is a bit, you know, you hope a bit better for him, but he'll still make a few games next year.
Yep.
And then hopping back up the list, a player that I think's pretty underrated. Only played a few games last season, but in terms of what the Dons could use in the middle, which is more defensive grit, they leaked a lot of stoppage clearance points, and I think Will Setterfield, he'll be the one to give him a big boost in that inside midfield, not just of the centre bounces, but the ball ups around the ground. He is a very decent ground ball player. He only had 4 games for 2024, but he was a tackling machine, got a good amount of clearances from them, and I think their midfield just... I only remember a couple of games, but it did definitely look a lot better with Setterfield in there. So if the Dons want to retain their best quality, the Essendon edge, so to speak, if that does come from the midfield, I think Will Setterfield is the sort of person that will make that midfield even better. A person that they missed last year, the Jordan Ridley, sort of a flex defender. He can play on the tolls, can play on the mediums, loves a good intercept, but lost to a hip flexor to start the year and a quad injury to end the year. And, it's fair to say with the lack of talent in Essendon's backline, they need him to be that next core. They still have, players around him. Ben Mackay, obviously they want a bit more synergy with him because you sort of saw it. Ben Mackay was okay last year.
Mm-hmm.
Not as much as you would want from getting that big pull, but because Essendon were exposed so much out the back and they were forced into a lot of one-on-ones, they didn't have much in terms of like intercept defense. They want someone like Jordan Ridley to prevent some of the bomb-in entries from becoming one-on-ones where, Ben Mackay might get exposed.
Yeah.
So, a very important play for next year. Going into the ruck and sort of the forward, I've got Sam Draper, which I don't know about controversial player, but he tends to have a lot of opinions surrounding him.
He does.
I think he's pretty good. Probably a bit overhyped by the media, but there's a lot of players like that. But you can't stress enough how much of a liability Goldstein was last year. Not so much in the ruck, but around the ground. He just looked, I won't say unfit, but he looked a lot past it. And honestly, they're a team that's looking for maybe next year, they're playing a younger team. Put Goldstein in more of like a coaching playing role. You know what I mean? Like maybe give him a few more games on the bench. Don't play him exactly. I know Goldstein wants to play, but I just don't see why Essendon would do that with the list that they're looking to produce next year. And they might be looking towards Nick Bryan, who was a young ruck who was playing at the end of last year. So if they do play him, Draper adds a bit of offense and he can support the young ruckman. If he's, down, it's just Nick Bryan having a bad game, put his time on field a bit lower, put Draper more inside the ruck, because he is good at collecting the ball after clearances. He's obviously very exciting and does a lot of exciting taps. He's very aggressive. So again, with low scoring from stoppages, Sam Draper just might be that player that if he lifts a bit and if he's able to support the team around him, because again, I don't think he's number one ruck material. I still think that, there's a lot to be added by a good Sam Draper year. And then rounding it all off, Zach Reed. again, a defender I've sort of mentioned. Hard for him to get going, and this is a hopeful one because when you look at Essendon's list and their defenders, they don't really have much to go to. So he was picked as a ready-made top 10 draft, top 10 in the draft as a ready-made defender, but unfortunately suffered a lot of injuries in his short career. But the games that he has played, albeit small, albeit with different defensive structures, is not looked too bad. So if, with the loss of some of their defenders, like Jake Kelly or, even if, some of their defenders who are looking to come back take a bit of a while, you look at someone like Zach Reed to hopefully just provide a bit of support. Again, Ben Mackay struggled a bit on the 1-1s. If you can force context where Zach Reed's also coming in, try and spoil the ball away, you might see Essendon's defense lift a bit. And that's sort of all you want. Not expecting to play 22 games, but he's just a player that you want to look with a bit of optimism for. And you got to hope they just gets on the park too, because again,
hopefully he's one of the what's the word that I'm looking for? One of the depth players that actually helps solidify some of their issues rather than is constantly coming in and out, in and out.
Yeah, exactly. And especially with next year, if they hopefully a bit less injured, he won't have as much pressure to come in and, take too big a role, especially coming back from injury. But I do think there's a bit there with someone like him. And again, they just need more solid defensive efforts. And as Zach Reed, someone who might be able to provide that for them.
Agreed.
And if we go to new faces, here's someone who might take a bit of pressure off for them. Jackson Pryor. I still haven't figured out if his name's spelled with 1 or 2 X's. I apologize.
I think it's 1X.
1X, okay. Key defender, NAB from Brisbane, and featured in only 18... Sorry, he featured in 18 games in his debut year as a late draft pick prospect. Looking good, but he just couldn't break into that pretty settled line side. He featured in only 4 games last year, half of those being sub-affected. So for the Dons, they've got a young key defender who's keen, few seasons under their belt. He got 3rd in the reserves best and fairest for the club he plays for. I think it was just the... Well, I'm not sure, actually. I think it was like a Queensland affiliate team. So, yep. So, basically, it's a bit iffy. It might be a really nice nab. It might be one of those players where you go, wow, as I said, it was a bit of a shame that he, was drafted in such a settled team because, he was a really good pick.
Yeah.
But it's a lot to ask for him at the same time because, as I said, Jackson Pryor, again, I'd probably rate him above someone like Zach Reed. But the fact that it got both of them puts a bit less pressure on needing one to perform. So I would say Jackson Pryor, pretty good pickup. If he becomes a depth player, he becomes a depth player. But still worth noting, even though he was just a supplementary draft pick. And again, I got to talk about the new draft pick, Isaac Keiko. I don't often put the draft picks in there unless I think they're going to fill in a role straight away. And as we've talked about, the whole of Stringer means that they are probably going to rely on him in his first year. Hate to put the pressure on the kid, and I just want to let him play. But if you can produce a few good metrics as a small forward, it doesn't even have to be goals. It could be ground pressure. It could be good forward stoppage pressure. It could be tackles inside 50. You just need to get something from him, let him build his game, but also still provide pieces around him to lift other work. Again, you don't want to be relying on Isaac Keiko to get 40 goals on debut, because as a small forward, it just doesn't happen. I don't even know if 40 goals on debut, maybe in the 90s or something, you might have seen it. I'm not even sure, but I think it would be fairly unheard of. So let us know if you know a player that scored 40 goals on debut. I don't think it's going to be Isaac Keiko, but very important. But very exciting as well. You saw him kick I think it was a couple of match winners for the Vic Metro side last year.
Yeah, I believe
seems
so.
Seems to love the game. Seems to love the pressure. So In a struggling side, that might be like a little live wire thing as well, because as we know, Jake Stringer, he doesn't really bring that live wire action. You know what I mean? He's
Yeah.
definitely more of a in and out, comes in, breaks the game open, but then goes a bit quiet. So Isaac Keiko for the long-term future, probably really good.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
after all that, we'll go for the reasons for optimism. And for Essendon, they go from, I know this is a bit of a weird one, but they go from being the 7th oldest club to the 12th oldest club. Almost a year and a half younger than Collingwood. And I think, and I don't know if you agree with this, but I think this age profile is a lot more reflective of where they are as a club. Because they're clearly trying to develop younger talent to patch up
Yep.
their problem areas, unlike last year's, especially the Dodoro era, where they were just putting money to free agents. Sometimes not even the best free agents, but the mid sort of free agent tiers. I mean, you're talking about your Devon Smiths, you're talking about your Dylan Shield, you're
Yep.
talking about who was the other one as well? Ahmed Saad? I can't remember which way he went for.
Yeah, it might have been no.
I think it was
No,
Suns,
Saad
Essendon,
started at Essendon and then went to Carlton.
Okay. Yeah, there's probably another one. I didn't put it in the notes. I just had that thought then. But as I said, I think this is sort of where they need to go. They can't rely on stopgap because we saw in the stats, there's nothing that a stopgap player can fix in those metrics. You know what I mean? It's just a bit too across the board. And talking about those metrics, they did lose a lot of players in defense last year. So while they were very similar to a bottom four team in terms of defensive metrics, and in fact, faster rate defenses, I'll probably put Essendon in that bottom four. In terms of hope, they've got a core of Ridley, Redmond, Mackay. Again, if one of those like Jackson Pryor or Zach Reed can lift up and provide a bit in their defense, they've got something to work with. It's not that doom and gloom. But obviously, you need them to link up with their pretty good halfbackers in McGrath and Martin, who distributed pretty well.
Yeah,
And
they
Nick
did.
Martin last year, that's also another reason why their distribution was so good. Because again, they weren't so good in the stoppages, but for someone like Nick Martin who could find targets, even if they were cheap, getting marks, providing that cheap option to get the ball moving, they did really well in that regard. And I think that's also why they performed as well as they did, despite having those flaws.
Yeah. Agreed.
And the final thing I want to mention, oh, sorry, you go.
No, I was just saying that I completely agree with you because as we talked about all season long, Nick Martin was probably one of their highlight players. Him, Zach Merritt, they were the big two that kind of had the most impact during last season. And then Jade Gresham as well. He was a big signing from last year. Came over from St Kilda. He had a decent impact, was injured a little bit here and there. Same with Dersma, who came over from Port Adelaide. So they had some really good signings that they can still build upon. It's just unfortunate that injury got to them. But hopefully a solid season with all of those like bigger core players together, along with, again, cultivating their younger talent, hopefully finding a decent or a more solid defensive lineup, again, with Ridley, Redmond, Mackay, and hopefully some of the, like someone like Reed to hopefully come in and fill that gap. Hopefully, it makes that much of a difference.
Yeah, and, also why I didn't mention Xavier Dersma is because, their transition was good. So, while it's great to have him back, that's like another just bit of extra. I don't think it's going to change much of Essendon's win-loss. But again, in terms of getting the structure you want for the years going forward, Dersma is a really good player
100%.
to have back. And, talking about like midfield, I know he's outsider, but, as I said, we've mentioned that the narrative, probably even from last year, it was Zach Merritt and Passengers over the last half decade.
Mm-hmm.
I think these new youngsters and the new breed of game plan is sort of hinting that, it's still Zach Merritt, based, but because the other players are so good at providing at their roles, I know stoppage structure wasn't the best, but centre clearance structure, at least you can work off that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Especially since they're young. You hope stoppages increase, but they are still good at the centre clearance. And they're still getting the ball to Zerrett, because it's not just Zerrett winning everything. He's got 13 handball receives per game. And when you sort out the list of all the players, there's only 2 people above him on that stat, which is Walsh and Treloar. And when you think about their midfields, in terms of possessions, they're 2 of the best midfielders in both clearances and post clearances.
They are.
So that's, the efforts outside the clearance. So for him to be getting that many handball receives, I think shows that, there's still a good enough structure for a Zerrett-based midfield to exist.
No, 100%. And again, and that's a lot of that is also partially due to his leadership capabilities. Again, he is captain after all. So he does take a lot of, I guess, the brunt both on field and off field in terms of boosting not just team morale but his midfield core morale, and trying to encourage the players that he's playing with to don't think just about giving the ball to him just because he's the best player in your midfield. Do what you can to support your teammates, whether it's going in or out, or even it's okay to try and make a hero play and go for the shot inside 50 yourself, etc., etc.
Yeah, because that is the one thing that probably will have to improve. Not so much the amount of inside 50s, but the quality difference between Merritt's inside 50s
and everyone else's
he's
inside
one
50s.
Of the higher. Yeah, exactly. It's one of the higher midfield for score involvements, but in terms of Essendon's list, it sort of dips. So again, we saw how inefficient their inside 50s are. It wasn't all just the forward line. I think there's a tiny bit that they can improve on, but considering they're so young, I think it's just steps at a time. So hopefully we might see that evolution next year as well. But for the slightly disappointing parts, we've sort of alluded to this before. Essendon have made plans, from what we can gather, that say we are a long-term future team. And unfortunately, with that, the brunt of the negative aspect of this is going to be experienced in 2025.
Yep.
Again, paper-thin defensive stocks. They're going to have to rebuild the 40 goals it was for Jake Stringer. And again, unfortunately, Langford too, in the back half of 2024, really dropped off in terms of shots taken. So again, they need that midfield link up to get to him better, because they can't afford for Langford to have a quiet season. So again, I've sort of, made the little joke, they need some conversion, because otherwise their midfield is rather pointless or, for pun's sake, goalless. So, you can't win a game purely off your midfield. You can use a strong midfield to paper over some average forward play, but there is a line, and Essendon is sort of where we saw that line stop, because as we saw, they were good at scoring against either teams that were struggling to convert or a weaker team. But when the other team had their fair share of the ball, it was just an equation where their efficiency could not keep up with their opponent. So they were always getting outscored, not by much, only a few games where they got beaten, but it was still a big concern. And, it sort of links up with the point above, but with no free agent pools, it's up to the kids to fill the void of the season, either by out of form or injury-prone veterans. So they still on their list have, as we mentioned, Gresham. Again, that was more injury. Goldstein, a bit of form. Shield, a bit of both. Darcy Parish, a bit of form. Peter Wright, a bit of form. And Laverde in the back line, which was a bit of a form drop-off. So, while they do have that young talent, it's actually some of the older veterans. I think, honestly, if you look at the entire list, only a few bottom 4 teams, I would expect some of these players to just slot right in.
Yeah.
Like Peter Wright, because he's a cold forward, probably makes a few teams. I know it's a bit hit or miss, but still a solid key forward. But you're really not looking at much. Gresham would go on depth for most teams. Shields much more part of it. I don't know what's going on with Parrish, but he's never really looked that great for the last couple of years. So, yeah. So they really need some older players to lift, and I don't think it's actually going to happen. And again, despite being in the top half for much of 2024, their finals standings suggest they are much nearer to the bottom three than the top eight. We mentioned this before. All the teams between Essendon and West Coast allowed less points to be scored against them, with some, Gold Coast and Adelaide, even outscoring the Dons in 2024. So, by most metrics, it was pretty lucky for the Dons to finish where they were, even with that good start. So, if percentage is a true indicator of form, I'm a semi-subscriber of that. Yeah, there's sort of teams that might not be as bad, might not be worse than Essendon, who finished below them on the ladder, which going into next year, we've mentioned a lot of improvements. Probably not as many immediate improvements for Essendon. We'll go to the Psyrick verdict. Sort of reflects that. Again, 2024, I was impressed they did so well considering their flaws. I think Brad Scott's a very good coach in that. And I think that also provides a bit of optimism because he's honestly a coach where he can plug thin lists. And we saw it a bit with North. Obviously, a lot more talent in the higher bits of North those years, but still, they didn't really have many star players. And this Essendon team is sort of like that. They've got a few key components. They're working around them. But we're really not expecting them to be a threat in 2025, are we?
No.
It's just a bit too much.
Not at all. I completely agree with the fact that they're definitely going to miss finals.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, I've got the predicted range of 12th to 18th. So I think that's the first team I've mentioned. That's possibility for the wooden spoon. I don't think it can happen, but honestly, with a few injuries, you're really getting into some pretty rough players. So my gut feels 15th. That's the top of the bottom four. I just think there's a few stabler teams around them. So if we go to the ladder prediction, again, capping from last week, at the top we've got Brisbane at number 2, 8 Collingwood, 9 Carlton, 10 Adelaide, and 15th we have got the Essendon Bombers.
Exactly right. That's exactly what we see in front of us. Real question is there a possible chance of our next team ending up as as close to where Essendon is, or as close to where Brisbane is?
Are we talking about Fremantle?
Yes, I am talking about Fremantle.
Okay, cool.
I was trying to figure out a good way to kind of lead into it.
Segue into it. Okay, yeah, no, that's sure. So yeah, honestly, gonna give you a hint. I think they're a bit above Essendon, especially in terms of defense.
Just a bit.
Just a fraction above. But they're a team with a bit of flaws and a few depth issues. So you can see here. Technically, this is a picture of the AFLW. I got a little picture of me for Johnny Docker. Love to see it. One of the best mascots in the league. I did stretch the picture just to make it a bit more funny as well. So
it is pretty
please
funny.
Don't judge me. Please don't judge me in the comments too much. Or you can. I don't mind. But a bit of a strange season for Freo. Started off pretty well. I guess the mixed bag really came with injuries. They won the first 3 games against Brisbane North and Adelaide, but in the process, they lost both Brendan Cox and Oscar McDonald in the opener, and they lost to Carlton, Port, and West Coast in their next 3 games. So it was a very up and down start. A lot said about the end of the year, but their start of the year was also a bit up and down considering, but a few good wins after that. Combined with the emergence of Josh Treacy, a player we probably won't talk about too much because he was pretty set in their forward line. But excellent distribution, terrific goalkeeper. I think he topped the list for them. And by round 13, they were a very solid 7, 1, and 4. That draw coming from Collingwood, which I mistakenly gave to the Bombers. But, yep. So then they shocked the football landscape by being the first team to beat Sydney, doing so by a solitary point. looking very clutch in the process. And by round 20, they were third on the ladder, looking to make finals. And then the run home. They lost their captain, Alex Pearce, with a fractured arm a bit earlier in the season. It was the thumping win against the D's.
Mm-hmm.
And they sort of lost a bit of clutchness in defense. They had leads. They blew a few of them very fast. They had that 1 point loss against the Dons, the 11-point loss against the Cats,
Mm-hmm.
the 9-point loss against GWS, and the finished round 20. They still had the shot, couldn't get it done, but there were all games where they had the lead, and a bit of control would have seen them get finals, but they, by the barest of margins, miss. Despite getting 50 points on the ladder, they would be 10th with a record of 12, 1, and 10, which, as again, just shows how crazy last year's was.
Yeah,
Not only that they missed on finals, they weren't even like the best record to miss finals. There was a team with 2 points above them who still couldn't get in. So
yeah, that
absolutely crazy.
that last season, especially as we looked at the last 4 rounds, was just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. And, as I said, honestly, the Bombers were the only one that were really. It was probably a team where a top 8 team probably should have been winning.
Mm-hmm.
But, the Cats at Optus, the Power at Optus, and the Giants at NG, it's some very tough teams to finish out the year. So it wasn't like they really lowered their head, but unfortunately for the Dockers, it was really a case of, they were just needing one of those things to go their way. And if we go back even earlier, that controversial touched ball that wasn't called touch against the Blues, touched twice, in fact, to go to, I think it was like Matt Cottrell or someone to kick the winning goal. I forgot.
It was something like that, yeah.
Oh, no, it was a 50-meter penalty, that's right, by Jai Clark, who otherwise had a fantastic year. But again, so, as we see by the stats overview, despite all this, they still had a pretty solid 2024. Again, what I mentioned before, there's a few bits and pieces in areas, but when you look at the whole, at least they have a very consistent game plan. And that game plan was one of the rare teams to focus a lot of their scoring off back half play.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the great teams this year in terms of scoring, Carlton, Geelong, Brisbane, even Sydney, arguably, even though they're a mixture of both. Forward half teams, Western Bulldogs, another one. Fremantle did okay. They got 9th in goals, which compared to other Fremantle seasons, pretty good. They scored 12.4 goals a game. Their score off back half, which I mentioned before, 35.6, which is 5th in the league.
Mm-hmm.
And they also, even though they were a back half team, they were willing to work the ball forward, and their efficiency in getting their marks inside 50 and getting easy shots was good. Their X score per shot, which I'm using this as a rank of difficulty, they're getting 3.32 points per shot, which is very good in the league. That gets you 4th.
Mm-hmm.
So 4th easiest shots taken. Their offensive wins, somewhere in the middle. Don't go to too many one-on-one contests, but still fared good enough in those things. In that regard. And their scores per inside 50, 50.1, 5th, which is very unusual for the Dockers. Normally we know them as a team that struggles at times to find the player to make the shot. So that improved last year. Marks inside 50, around even. Mark inside 50 rate, though, was pretty good. So again, it was that calculated control at entry.
Mm-hmm.
But on the flip side, if the ball did go to ground or it didn't end up that way, their opposition tackles inside 50, 13.2, tied 18th in the league. So they struggle to find that shot maker. We're talking about players that are a bit good below deck. Obviously, we see players like Michael Walters getting older. Sam Switkowski, he's not really a shot taker. Bailey Banfield, he's not really a ground and collect sort of shot. So again, missing that sort of player. And that's also reflected by the forward 50 ground ball gets, which is 14.1 at 14th in the league. So basically, Freo, above the head, really, really good. And the ball hits the deck, that's where they sort of get a bit mediocre. And then going to... Actually, it's a bit of a toss-up. I'll let Blaze decide afterward what he wants to give the best line to. Their worst line's probably their offense. We're going to their defense now. And in goals against, they are one of 3 teams to be tied first at 11 goals against. But would you believe me, Blaze, that their defensive one-on-one wins only 30%? So
I believe that, and that's
sorry, that's loss. Oh wait, yeah,
I believe that,
yeah.
and I think that's because a lot of their defensive 1-on-ones came from Alex Pierce. So as soon as they lost him, that just kind of dropped for them.
Dropped off. Again though, they didn't, and it's still the way they play. They're more of a coverage, as we said. A lot of stuff with
They're a very good intercept team rather than just a 1-on-1 defense team.
That's what I was saying. Luke Ryan, as we said, when he shifted from an intercept defender to a more 1-on-1 defender, that hurt a bit. Spoils, again, they were 18th in the league. So they prefer the intercept mark. They prefer the stuff ahead of the ground to try and prevent scores from being scored. And that's why I'm like to highlight their opposition scores from defensive half. 27.5, which is the 3rd in the league. So 3rd lowest scores against in terms of that. Opposition scores off turnover, 41, 3rd lowest in the league. Opposition X score per shot still a bit high. So they were letting easy shots through again. When, as I said, unfortunately the downside to being that intercept team is sometimes you do let some of those easy shots through. So again, a bit of a mark against their defense. But overall, listing a few better stats. Rebound 50 rate, 76, 5th in the league. Opposition inside 50s, 49.4, 5th in the league. Opposition goals per inside 50, 22.3%, 5th in the league. Set shots per inside 50, 43.1 in the league, 5th in the league. And opposition scores per inside 50, 2nd in the league at 45.6. So really dingy defense. When you break through, you can get a few good looks. But for the most part, they are going to make it hard for you.
Yeah, definitely. And most of that again comes off of their very excellent rebound work, very excellent intercept work. But yeah, those defensive 1-on-ones, they definitely really missed Alex Pierce when it came to that.
Yeah, but I think as well, it's sort of hard because again, some of these defense stats can sort of contribute to the movement stats because being so calculated and not turning the ball over came a lot from their half back line, and it's sort of reflected in their movement stats. So they're a very high disposal team, a lot of chipping in the back half, as we talked about. Again, Longmire famously said, we're not here to pad our super coach stats in the back line. We want a few more aggressive disposals. But they still, always being a control team with ball in hand. 367.2 disposals per match, 4th in the league. One of the higher handballing teams, 160.8, 2nd in the lead with a kick percentage of 56.2, which is 17th in the league. Again, not a bad stat. Like, because it's red, it doesn't mean that, they're a terrible team because of this. But that's just the style they play. Yep. Again, low meters per disposal, 15.7, 16th in the league. But because of how hard they work around the ground, their meters gain differential, 160.3, would you believe it, 6th in the league. So they still out-metered their opponents just by their control. Even if they were rinky-dink, they were still getting the ball moving. The clearances, 3rd in the league, 39.8. They were stoppage kings. There were 7.1 plus clearance differentials. So, they didn't get as many clearances as other teams because they're a control team. You get to see less balls up and all that. But when they did, they absolutely dominated. And the stoppage clearances, just the pure stat, that was 27.7, 2nd in the league. Unfortunately, afterwards, they'll get the ball forward. But again, you saw a bit of a high turnover rate from those clearances. So post-clearance contested possession, 75.5 per game, 17th in the league. Ground ball gets from post clearances, 54.5, which is 17th. So some of their outside midfield support, some of their link up, that could have been a bit better. But otherwise, it was a pretty comprehensive midfield. Their ground ball was also pretty good. Differential against opposition, 4.3 more than their oppositions, which is 5th in the league. But their marks on league, despite taking a lot of marks, it was very chippy, as I said. Their marks on league differential was a negative 1.6, which is 15th. And their turnover differential was they produced 4 more turnovers than the opposition, which again, because I mentioned, they didn't turn the ball over that much. It was very much they didn't also create turnovers. And when you look at Fremantle, some of their defensive pressure acts, which were also pretty low, I didn't put them in because I don't think it really means that much, but they were a very low pressure team. They didn't generate turnovers. They were one of the worst crumbing teams in the league, which is possession after a marking contest spill.
Yep.
So really, and the interesting thing because it's very hard to explain this without looking at the other teams, but they're the only teams that are low pressure to have that negative intercept generation. So, a lot of low pressure teams, the pressure sort of comes because a lot of pressure acts, I should say, are corralling players.
Yeah.
They're smothers, all that sort of thing. So they're pressure on the ball carrier. So if you have a lot of pressure on the ball carrier, you should be expecting that if it goes past them, they might be able to do something. And the opposite sort of true. If there's low pressure on the ball carrier, you hope to make that out in other areas of the field.
Yes.
But Freo didn't really do that. So it was sort of weird where they were very good in slow play, and they were very good when the defense was set. But again, there weren't so much pressure, so oppositions were getting the good looks. And again, that's also hints to maybe why oppositions were able to get good set shots. Just shots in general against Freo, despite their stats looking so good. And it's maybe even why they had defensive one-on-one wins. Because less play on the ball carrier, they have the time to find that best option inside 50. So, a bit to work on there. But again, I'll let you decide who's going to be the winner of this. I think, in terms of their lines, it's a pretty close contest between their movement stats, again, that inside to outside connection, or just their defensive structure, because they were very sound despite losing a few players.
I am very partial to defensive work. I'm a big fan of defensive work. You know me, I'm a big fan of on-ballers in the midfield, for example. One that keeps obviously coming to mind is Jack Crisp at Collingwood. As much as I don't like Collingwood as a whole, I like Jack Crisp. He does good work. So I'm a big fan of Freo's defensive work. I think they're easily, as the stats really tell, they are one of the best defenses in the competition. I think once they have no one injured, specifically Alex Pearce, because he does so much work back there. He could easily be the best defense in the comp. I do like their midfield. What I would like, again, is probably a little bit more pressure on the ball carrier. More pressure acts from them, I think, would definitely help solidify more benefits to their offensive work. But, if it's not in their play style to really do so many pressure acts, put so much pressure on the on the ball carrier, then if they're able to make up for it in their inside 50 work, in their goals, score assists, etc., then I think they shouldn't really have to change all that much. It might just be personnel changes that will more benefit what they're trying to go for.
Even last year, we saw it a bit late. It's very risky when you take a player of his caliber outside the centre bounces. But when we saw Hayden Young sort of rotate forward a bit more, we did see them get a few more. Well, first of all, he was actually a really good mark inside 50. Like, he made a lot of separation against his opponents.
He has great hands.
Did really good work. Yeah, he does. And again, it's getting that ground ball work up the field, because it's no good getting those clearance, again, bombing it long, and just have the ball trickle to the ground and get out of there. Because, as I said, it affects your efficiency. I didn't put a lot of the efficiency stats in because they were very mid. So not the worst in the competition, but definitely a point of improvement. And obviously there's a player in their forward 50 who's going to get a bit of ground ball, but it'll be interesting to see if they do set up a bit of rotation with Hayden Young for next year, because he looked good going forward, but it's a bit pick where you want to put one of your best players because he's so damaging. But with Sarong and Brayshaw providing clearances and, Brayshaw being the best defensive player of the trio, as I said, it does give you a bit of flexibility to work with that.
Yeah, 100%.
So we're going to go through the list changes.
Do you want me to talk about it?
Oh, you can. Yeah, you can mention it, I guess.
Well, it's kind of the emboldened one on the list. So let's just talk about Shea Bolton. I still don't really rate him at this point in time. I think his midfield ethic just wasn't there. Granted, 2024 was not a great year for us at Richmond in general. Everyone knows this. But also in the past couple of years, his work ethic has just gone down. I feel like he's one of those players that always tries to play for the highlight reel. Essentially, it's how it always feels like. Became more of like a solo player rather than a team player. I'm hoping that his move to Freo will actually make him realize that working with the team is far more beneficial, especially if he gets put into the forward line and has to do that sort of crumbing work that Freo really requires of him. Because as you mentioned before, that's one of the parts of their forward line that has been a little bit of an issue over last season. So who knows, maybe that'll actually be so much better for him. And then, they picked up some pretty interesting players in the draft. We've got Jaron Carr, Murphy Reed, Charlie Nichols. Quentin Nuthall came from the SSP, originally from Port Adelaide in this case. Prior to that, he was at Geelong. And then Aiden Riddle, who came from the rookie draft. And then quite a few D-lists. Josh Corbett was the only retiree. But with the D-listants, we've got Tom Emmett, Ethan Hughes, Max Noble, Spitqueck, I don't know how to pronounce that.
Sebek, yeah.
Thank you. Ethan Stanley, Conrad Williams, and the big one being Matt Taberner.
Yeah, honestly, I highlighted Tommy Emmett and Matt Taberner, not because I think they're big losses, you know what I mean? Like, Matt Taberner wanted to play on. Freo just couldn't find a way to fit him in the team in terms of the mix between the future growth. They've got a few young key forwards and that. But he did play, I think he played 10 games in 2025. So it's 2024. Unless he gets picked up in the rookie draft, I don't think... mid-season draft. I don't think that will be a 2025 thing, but who knows? Stranger things have happened. And Tommy Emmett, he played all the games. Almost all the games last year. So, to delist players that played a big chunk of games in 2024 means that they're gonna have to refill them somewhere. And especially a player like Tommy Emmett, who I thought didn't quite look up to par for most of it. They weren't replacing him because they arguably didn't. Obviously, it was a bit controversial whether Will Brodie should have come back into the side. Up in the air about that. But, so it's going to be interesting in terms of depth. And we'll talk about it a bit later. But definitely a few interesting things there. So we're going to go to important players for 2025. And, as I said, in these things, I like to pick out players that you don't always think about or, a bit under the radar. But for this one, I've put in some pretty big names. And the first one is the young gun key forward, Jai Amos. I don't know how you view this. We don't count 2022 because he only played one game. But this was arguably second-year blues, I reckon, from Jai. And I think it came down to a mixture of things. This was the first time he was playing not so much pure key forward, but he had a lot more assignments on his own. So games where he didn't have Taberner, he was playing with someone like a Patrick Voss, where he has to be the reliable body and Voss has to work off him, sort of thing. So he struggled a bit with that role. Very understandable. Happens to a lot of players, happens to a lot of good players. But the other thing is his accuracy crashed down to mediocre. And the good thing, on the flip side, he still took a solid amount of marks inside 50. So he's been doing the right things, he's presenting well, and I think he will bounce back next year. And if he can share the load more evenly with Josh Tracy, it is a very dual threat. Like 1 and 2, that's locked, you know. Arguably, you know, as I said, Tracy is technically what I'll call a third tall, which is the player that starts more off half forward, you know, half forward flank, and distributes a bit more. But because he's so tall, it's an easier target as well. But, you know, as I said, so really they've got their key forward, they've got their forward number 3, his distributor, but they need that separation forward, which I think's a bit up in the air. I don't think that's going to happen this year. But if Jai Amos can just have some natural growth, we'll see improvement in that Fremantle forward line anyway.
Yeah. I completely agree, because he's definitely one of the exciting players in that forward line that we really want to see massive growth from.
Yeah. Now going for another area where, again, I don't think they need growth, but I'm a bit interested in this. Heath Chapman, general defender for Freo, obviously remembered for his goal line spoil against Adelaide a few seasons ago. But he was predicted to be a bit of a wing player for 2024. Obviously, if you remember, or Freo fans will remember, pretty much for the last 5 years, they've lost their best wingman each year. In fact, this is probably the first year in ages where they haven't lost a wingman. But Chapman was sort of predicted maybe to be a wing player. They rotate a lot with people like Aish as the second wing. O'Driscoll came in a couple of times. And obviously on the flip side, Jeremy Sharp was pretty much the consistent wing on the other side of things. So they still haven't found it. They still haven't found their second winger. So it'll be interesting to see if he, you know, stays on that wing role or he goes back to halfback, because I really thought he was much better as a defender. Very solid and still young. Great ball use. And I think he acts as like a conduit to the threatening Jordan Clark. Because, you know, again, Jordan Clark, you know, we've mentioned it. It's not so much you have to have specific, like, you don't, I think the half-back role, it's always focused on one player, but I reckon it's always like a tandem thing where you got the line breaker and you got the distribution user.
Yeah.
And the line breaker, you can create that speed, take the ball down the wing on your own hand. But if you need distribution, it's what Fremantle does. I think Heath Chapman's actually a very good role filler for that. And also, you know, I guess we'll link it up. Skipping ahead a bit. But Luke Ryan, you know, I've said before, I think his 2024 season was not so much overrated in the fact he's getting All-Australian, because obviously his work was judged on his intercept, it was judged on his disposal. But as a defender, it was really mediocre. And, you know, he was involved in a lot of Freo scoring chains. But they've got a lot of good movement player. So, you know, I even mentioned, like, he's the fourth highest defender in score of scoring in terms of scoring chains, in terms of key defenders. So it is unusually high. And, you know, it's interesting for me because I still think he should be involved in some scoring chains when he has Kearse and hopefully Cox back around him. Cox is also a very important player to get back. I think he can do his job as an aggressive spareman defender, but I think you just got to back him in to do a bit more one-on-one work because, again, Alex Pearce has got that injury risk. There's not many seasons where he hasn't been injured. Same with Brennan Cox. So I would actually like to see a bit of his offensive games at times take a back seat so he can defend a lot harder.
Yeah.
Because, as I said, they've got spare defenders. They've got a lot of players who can play off halfback. What they need is just to make sure that they're always consistently solid, and then they won't see like those iffy losses that they've got in the middle to end part of 2024.
Yeah, I completely agree. Again, as you have already said, like Alex Pearce, Brennan Cox, they are injury prone to some degree. You just need that extra reliable defender to be able to fill those holes. Even if, you know, Luke Ryan, for the most part, is in their best 22. But even if they have to bring in someone extra that's more of a depth player to try and help fill those roles when when it happens, especially to work work a lot closer with Luke Ryan specifically, considering he is that spare man, then yeah.
And the player that obviously did that was the young player, Sammy Draper. Obviously not too much hype behind his first season, but he was pretty good. If you're a West Australian, you definitely had a keen eye on him. But he did get beaten a lot. Like, he's still young. His body won't probably be enough next year for him to take any, I would say, serious opponents. But he did actually take a few key players, and he just got beaten a lot of the time. So that's why I'm saying Luke Ryan, he just needs to do it, like, for the team, I think. And, you know, I'm not saying, like, it's a personal thing. This is more like a coaching thing. Because, you know, as I said, Luke Ryan, he does what he does. Like, he's clearly an intercept player. He does his job really well. I'm not trying to knock him. But in terms of, you know, what I'm saying is, for the roles he was asked to do last year, as a key defender, he fell under.
Yeah.
But he was just a really good spare man. And he'll always be a really good spare man. And his distribution's absolutely fantastic, especially for a kicking team. Yeah, and the final two, another injury-playing player, Sam Sturt, utility forward. And I was amazed that Sam Sturt played this year. I think I might have said in the preseason, he looked awful in one of the preseason's games. He was already a fringe player, and I was like, I really don't see myself seeing Sam Sturt on the football park in 2024. He did for a few games in the back half of 2024, and he played really solidly. Like, he was playing a sort of distributing role like Sam Swiskowski would do, but he was a lot more likely to score. He wasn't like, you know, I think with Sam Swiskowski and Bailey Banfield, and this is where a problem with Fremantle have, is like both of those, you're sacrificing a bit of offense to play those sort of players.
Yeah.
Fantastic pressure, but they're not quite there in terms of pure on their foot offense generation. So if someone like a Sam Sturt, you know, again, is a bit injury prone, maybe is an 18 game player next year. But you could see, you know, a bit more ground ball goals. You might see him filling the hole that, you know, well, not so much hole because they didn't play him overly too much, but Sonny Walters as he phases out of the Dockers' main attack. And to wrap it all up, a bit of the opposite of Sonny Walters, it's Sean Darcy. It's been much talk about. He's on that big contract, but is sort of like Sandilands was late in his career. If they can get him on the park, he is an absolute force to be reckoned with. His ruck stats are insane. 50% win chance of any ruck tap. 30% that any tap won will go to advantage. And he's actually a pretty good winner of offensive one-on-one. So he's a good rest forward. So, you know, that Luke Jackson, Sean Darcy combination, like that's 20 goals if you get, you know, or more, you know, for a year. It's very handy to have, but obviously a lot of it comes down to Sean Darcy being healthy. But again, a bit optimistic, but if he can have a 20 game season, Frio's upper limit just goes up a bit more.
Yeah, great.
Now, we'll just briefly cover Shai Bolton because you've already mentioned it. But I was reading an article in the ABC by analysts Cody Atkinson and Sean Lawson, and they basically ranked free age and stats like the projected career value of traded players in 2024. And Shai Bolton was above and beyond, like, the best value. Like, I know you have, you know, problems with his playstyle, and I agree. I actually think it's a bit iffy on the sort of way they integrate him into that offense.
Yeah.
In terms of raw talent,
oh no,
he was clearly the
raw talent wise,
100%,
100%.
Yeah. So, and I think I just want to highlight the one thing I can provide that Freo lack, and that's that leading marking ability. Because again, they're looking for that second sort of option, and I don't think Shea Dalton's going to play deep. He probably could. I don't think that's the best use of him, but is still dragging defenders out. Yes. I think that'll be great for Amos. You know, you'll see places like, you know, they're going to have to follow Shai Bolton coming up, So that also leaves Tracy because, if Shai Bolton's getting covered, maybe he takes one or two defenders away. Then Josh Tracy, he's already a threat out deep. He's already a great link-up player. He's still offense generation. So, again, he doesn't even have to play, 100%. Like, he can be a bit of a patchy player as long as they integrate him well. And, as we talk, that's about shot selection. That's about him knowing his role in the offense. It's going to have to be defined. He's going to have to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if they can, it should increase Freo's scoring potential. And Quinton Narkle as well. I'll just lump him in there. Another high half forward. Is 50 games for a pick 60, but isn't really a best 22 player. So, flashy bits of play. He's a bit of a Shai Bolton light, almost, really. But really not the worst player to come into the side if there's an injury. But he'll be behind other general forwards like Banfield, Switter, Frederick, Bolton, and Sam Sturt.
Yeah, he's definitely
already probably one of those.
Definitely always been a fringe sort of player. Never been able to solidify himself in a best 22, which is unfortunate and why he's already now been at 3 clubs. But we know he does have value as that sort of fill-in player.
Yeah, and as I said, it's depth in that forward line because, as I said, bringing in Bolton again, you're probably going to see someone like a Sam Sturt or a Michael Frederick miss a few games here and there.
Mm-hmm.
So, he's a bit behind, but again, he's in his home state. He's still playing football. It's good to see, and hopefully he might have a few moments of brilliance in 2025.
Fingers are crossed.
All right. The reasons for optimism. Like Gold Coast, like Collingwood, they were really a finals-worthy team. They just really got unlucky at the end of the day. There's not really much in between them and any of the... I mean, even in the top 4, but, 5th to 8th, not much in between them, and they have a good core of young talent. They jump from 5th in the league in terms of youngest to 8th in the league in player age.
Age differential.
Yeah. So a bit more experience. They weren't too far off the pace, but this is sort of the age profile that you tend to see teams break into the 8, start looking to be into the finals mix, deep finals mix, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? They landed a bit of a better future in terms of fixture in terms of this year, with a bit more home games. And, that might help lessen the chance of a string of close losses like last year.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the Bunbury game to North gets them the bit extra. I know it's, only one game and it's against North, but in terms of travel, that's always a plus. So it's one less game of travelling. Really good for them. A bit of a bone by the AFL when, a lot is said about fixture inequality. Another bit of optimism. They were the clearance kings of 2024. No doubt about it. And considering the age of Sarong, Young, Brayshaw, they have no reason not to back that up again. I should say no reason not. Anyway. So with more experience, another preseason to finesse a few things, and hopefully a healthy Darcy. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if some of those post-clearance work sharpen up a bit. If those bigger bodies are not just picking up the ball, but breaking a few tackles, finding the better option with that first handball, they should lift up a bit. And also going the other way, if they do get beaten in the contest, it won't be so much. They won't have players just brush them off, as we saw a bit last year. So hopefully that picks up a bit. And again, they need more reward from effort. And even though, as I said, Bolton, bit up and down player, he will finish off a few bits of plays. Like, he's a game breaker. He's got a bit of speed. So you link it up with that pretty good ball movement from Freo in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
And you see him playing a theoretically solid role in that forward line.
Yeah, agreed. 100% agree.
All right. And, reasons for pessimism. Again, they have a mix of forwards with a whole lot of talent, but the cohesion is something that I worry about a bit. I've mentioned a bit before. I've mentioned a bit about Shai Bolton, so I won't go too much into it. But again, they're bringing in a player, sub 70% disposal efficiency, very uncontested player. So he may not be the direct answer to their woes. I think they've got enough link-up players. But you know what I mean? It's sort of hard because to get Shai Bolton into the game, you have to give him the ball a bit early.
Yeah.
Again, he doesn't really play deep as much. So again, it's, you know, you might say, oh, you bring Shai Bolton in for a bit of excitement and polish, but you might also sacrifice a bit of efficiency to get that. So it's all swings and roundabouts.
100%.
So again, they already have a player that plays that similar role in Michael Frederick. I suspect he plays a few less games in 2025. But when you think about, you know, they already have that sort of player and still have a few problems, it's like, how much are you really gaining? And I know, you know, as I said, this is really just theory ball. You need to see a few games. But I could definitely see that forward line not improving as much as people think just because they got Shai Bolton in there.
Yeah.
So it's just a word of caution for Freo more than, you know, a huge things. Injury depth, big issue. Mentioned a bit before. Gave up a bit of a draft Antolan Bolt. So really, it's not just this year. It's the next couple of years where Freo are needing to develop some very raw and prospective draft talent in the next couple of years. The likes of which we saw already, they've delisted some players. You know, as I said, like your Emmets, like your Tabernars that had to play. They were playing players like Voss, who looked a bit raw. Draper, again, I mentioned he got beaten a few times. Kyle Warner, which is the WOR Warner. Emmett, who I said got delisted, and Liam Reedy, who I think also got delisted. No, Liam Reedy was the backup ruckman.
Yes,
I remember it. So, yep. So again, they have a fair few players in their best 22 that might be struggling to play 18 plus games next season. As I said, Walters, who I definitely don't think will. Fife, probably around that 18 mark. O'Meara, depends if he gets an injury. Alex Pearce, you hope so, but not sure. Same with Darcy. They're going to have to play those players at some point, and it's going to look a bit rough. And arguably, it's one of the reasons why they didn't make the 8 last year.
Well, as much as everyone has very much praised Nat Fife having this new role within the midfield, like it's fair. There's a fair chance that this could be his last season. So you'd want to hope they make it count, because you look at the age rating, the age range within that midfield, and he is the oldest player, and so it's he's definitely going to be pushing it to play even like 10, 12 games. Honestly, if he's able to stay fit, if his legs are able to stay good, then yeah, he could easily hit 15, 16, 17, maybe even 18 games. But it's going to be extremely close for him, and there's a fair chance he might not even travel all that much either.
No, exactly. But, you know, as I said, he's definitely there for a lot of leadership because, again, Andy Brayshaw, I'm just going to look it up. 25 years of age. He's getting to the point where he can become the leader of that midfield, but is still fairly young. And, you know, they've got other players in the midfield that they're developing. Neil Erasmus being one of them. They even tried out, who was I going to say? Another one too. No, Matt Johnson. That's right. It was a bit iffy, but, you know, as I said, so they've got players in the back, but, you know, as I said, Fife is definitely that player that is really just around as they transition. But you can't rely on him anymore in terms of that long-term future. So you really got to look into your depth and start hoping that they sort of develop a bit so that transition becomes clearer.
Yeah,
which 100%. I think is what you're sort of getting into. And you know, this year Freo's offense. The idea for Freo of this year was clearly offense. They added the piece that they thought could get them a bit into a more consistent scoring. I said get them out of scoring purgatory week in, week out, because they definitely had games where it was just a flat out no in terms of their offense. Like they absolutely butchered a game against Adelaide. They had like a couple of like 30, 40 points scored for. So, you know, although they had some big wins, they did have a lot where they were short. So, you know, it's like the other thing you also got to keep in mind is that Freo are moving the ball a lot to generate their offense, and they're a back half team, and that requires a lot of work around the ground to find the looks they want. Again, another reason why there's probably a bit less pressure, because when you put that much work into offense, defense sort of stagnates a bit. And not talking about their back six, I'm talking about their midfield and wingers. So if oppositions can just study and find a way to sort of restrict Freo, get him to take riskier kicks, force one more one-on-one contest, they might even prevent a lot of attack from happening. That's the biggest risk. If, they get this forward line, but the ball doesn't come in there anymore. Like, there's still a medium efficiency offense. So they're gonna have to make sure they continue that good work for next year.
100%. And yeah, it's just there's so much that they already have that makes them look really good, but they just need just a little bit of extra polish to kind of elevate it to the next level.
Yeah. And I think that should be fairly reflected in my verdict for them as we go into where I think they're going to finish in the ladder. Again, if it wasn't for their depth, I would probably have them as a finals lock for this year. I do think that their high-end talent is some of the best in the comp. They've got a midfield that can beat some of the better ones in the comps.
Mm-hmm.
They've got a defense which is very solid, and they've got at least some players in the offense. So you put that all together, and it's a pretty solid team. Again, it gets thin. If it gets an injury-plagued year, I could see a bit of a drop-off. But I predict the range is probably going to be 5th to 10th. So again, 10th maybe if they get a few injuries. Not too bad. If it's hugely injury affected, might even go lower than that. But in terms of normalcy, I reckon 5th to 10th. And I've put them as 6th. I really think that the way they play is a bit different. So, as I said, they might look, because oppositions, they mainly focus on their own team. So,
Mm-hmm.
teams might figure out Freo a bit. But because they're not the meta, I guess, of forward half teams, it's less likely to translate to other teams. So I don't think teams are going to go out their way too much. They're just going to do the basics. They're going to make sure they run hard on the wing or anything. But I don't think they're going to be like calculating, chopping off angles or whatnot. So I do think it will hold up. It held up last year. They were just a bit unlucky.
Yeah.
I'm putting them 6th on the ladder.
Yeah, I'd probably put them around a similar spot. Definitely not a hard top 4. But definitely a solid chance to make the top 8. And they would have to be extremely unlucky either with injuries or like a poor percentage rate to not make it overall.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said, it's so weird because it's like, it is reliant on a few things. But it's also like, Freo had those things happen this year and they still finished 9th. So that's why I'm predicting them a bit higher, because they're a team that can struggle through adversity,
Yeah.
They know how to cover their injuries. I personally think they're well coached, even though some of their game plan can look a bit boring. But at least you can see their direction. At least you can see what they're trying to do. And their young players are getting involved. So adds room for growth. Put them 6th, maybe even higher. I don't think they'll break the top 4, but out of the question.
No, 100%. All right. Next on our list is a team that is known to often make the finals. Has always been kind of a very strong team in the finals. However, for the past, let's say, 2 seasons, their performance has definitely waned a little bit than what we were used to over the past 2 decades, give or take. And that is Geelong.
Wayne's a bit hard for last year, but I know what you mean. They're definitely turning into a different style of team. And it's actually a point I put out later. But yeah, this year was very interesting because, they started off house on fire. They were called overrated after the 2023 campaign.
Mm-hmm.
People were expecting another drop off. Not me. I put them in the 8 because I'm a smart thinker, maybe.
Well, I mean, you kind of just look at them and you kind of expect them to always be in the 8, regardless of whatever a previous season was.
Yeah, and look, it wasn't that bad. It was just parts of the season a bit unlucky. But for 2024, absolutely fantastic. A lot of high scores. Start of the season 7-0. Only undefeated team with Sydney before their first loss. However, they did face a major hurdle in the season when Tom Stewart started to get tagged and it exposed Geelong's defence. You saw that really iffy run in the middle. People were saying, Geelong's lost the pace. Their 3 losses against the Demons, Power and Suns. 4 losses against the Giants as well.
Yeah, it was 4
And
losses in a
people were
row.
starting to say, yeah. In fact, wow, it was I should have put it in. It was uh
It was
6
6
out
losses in
of
7
7.
games. Yeah.
Yeah. So people were saying, oh, they're out of it, they're past it. But they did adjust, and it took a few things. I should mention in that game, it was still a pretty hard run. You know, you had the Power and Giants team, pretty tough, even if it's at Goomba. You know, it's two teams that do well in Goomba anyway, but also did well this year. And that loss against Melbourne was pre-Petrarca injury when they were looking really good.
And the game at the
TIO
Suns was,
Suns,
way up in
again,
Cairns.
and the Swans. So it was a bad stretch. I'm not gonna lie, but you know, in the context of things, it was like Brisbane's stretch,
Yeah.
where they had a few things not go their way. They had to tinker with a few things, but they were good enough to get back on track.
Mm-hmm.
It was even further sour when they lost Tom Hawkins to a foot injury in the loss against Carlton, ruled him out until finals. Again, didn't need to play him in finals because a few players stepped up, like Shannon Neal. He sort of filled that tomahawk role.
You did.
Tom Stewart, he moved into the guts at centre bounce, then drifted back, which broke tags because that it was like, do we want a tagger in the guts? That's not, you know, because obviously they're putting a more forward-based tagger in, so they're not necessarily inside midfielders. But Tom Stewart, he can be an inside midfielder, so smart thinking by Scott to free him up.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, Geelong ended the season strong, with their only blips being a scoring drought against the Doggies and a random halftime fade out against the Suns. They finished third on the ladder to finish with 15-8 record. So, you know, that 6 and 7 losses, they only have one more loss after that. So,
And not to mention, the emergence of surprising late draft player in Lawson Humphreys made a massive
yeah,
difference for them.
exactly. It was just, you rule them out, but they were getting so many players out of nowheres, and it just, you know, completely revitalized it. Should also took a bit of time in the playoffs in American mode, finals. Yeah, so they came up against a slightly bruised Port and made them look like absolute rabble. They gave them their own home game nightmare, a bit of revenge for losing at Goomba. 84 points, dominated the second half of that game. And despite having Hawkins and Rowan available, the kids backed in their squad. And, you know, I know they lost against Brisbane, but I like the way they approach this. They backed in the players that were working for them. And for the most part, they were right. And they had a really impressive first half. Max Owen gets injured. It was a bit of an arm wrestle. Only really just lost, I think it was like 10, but it was very much 2 very late goals. And, it was so entertaining. They bowed out of 2024, but it was very respectable in a season where they looked like they'd lost it at one point. So, you know, with that up and down season, like, was that reflected in the stats? And honestly, not really. You could see it a bit in their defensive stats, but for the most part, they look like a pretty complete team. They're the number 1 offense in the league, 14.1 goals per game, and 9.8 goals assists per game, which is 1 and 2 respectively. And the goals per inside 50 was 25.8, which is 4th. I didn't put the inside 50s, but I'm imagining because it was around the middle. So honestly, one of the most threatening teams when the balls went in there. They didn't have a high offensive 1-on-1 win rate. That was 12th. And, you know, they semi-targeted it. It was 7th. But if you look at the specific stats, a lot of that was just getting the ball to Jeremy Cameron.
Yeah.
We'll talk about later, but it was a high percentage of targets in offensive 1-on-1s went to him. Like, he had a win rate of 11% for the year, but he was like targeted. I think it was like 3.4 times per. It was something really high. I'm not sure if it was the best. I didn't actually look at that, but yeah. So again, a bit of a Jeremy Cameron focus, but he was that generator.
He was.
Could just,
because I just brought up the stats. He kicked 64 goals last year, which is crazy. And, 64 goals, 41 behinds, but that equates to over 100 in scoring shots. Or, like, scores.
Yeah, exactly.
Successful scores, which is crazy.
Yeah. And, the stats I said before, like, mark inside 50s, was absolutely great. So they're okay at the contested ones. They're okay just finding that loose player because, again, offensive one-on-ones, if you're not marked, it doesn't technically count as it. So if you're just free in the 50, you can still mark it. It just won't go up in that stat. So absolutely fantastic on the ground as well. Sorry, I should say for the Spotify listeners, marks inside 50, 13.4 first. Marks inside 50 rate, 24.5 third. Inside 50 ground ball gets, 16.6, tied third. Opposition rebound rate, 72.7 third. So obviously when you win the ground ball gets, it's very hard to rebound 50 because either you've gotten the mark or the opponent's generated the intercept or you've won the ball. So there's only one way for them to get it out. And again, a bit of a weird one. Like you say how mid or not as great Geelong's midfield is, but their score from stoppages, first in the league. Score from defensive half, 37.2, tied first in the league. Score from centre bounce, 14.2, first in the league. And 14.2 is like very high. Like you're lucky to get a goal from centre bounce, maybe a bit more. So to get 14.2 is pretty significant.
Very impressive.
And reflected in their clearance numbers. So they get 39 point clearances per game, which is fifth. Centre clearances 13 per game, which is second. They're not a huge disposal team though. So 350.4 disposals, that's 12th in the league. Disposal differential, their opponents get 12.9 more disposals than them. So that's 12th in the league. Meters gained differential, it's about average. Positive 89.1, which is 9th in the league. High meters per disposal, they send it long. And, you know this because they have a lot of line breakers. Obviously, the biggest one being Max Holmes.
Yes.
One of them. Patrick Dainfield is also a high meters per disposal player. So they get 17.7 per game. But again, that trade-off, disposal efficiency, worst in the competition with a fairly nice number in 69.6. Turnover differential, at least, was the best in the competition. 3.36 loss. So they generated more turnovers than they produced. First in the league. Intercept possession differential. So literally just the turnovers. Intercept possessions. So 3.7 first in the league. Ground ball get differential 4.3, fourth in the league. Crumbs 24.1 third in the league. Opposition contested mark 10th, 15th in the league. So they give up a lot of contested marks, but they're good on restricting the marks on league. So at least they're putting it to a one-on-one contest. They give 5 per match, which is tied first in the lead with Carlton.
Yes.
So summing it all up, very good midfield, great on the ground. Bombs it long, doesn't turn the ball too much over, even though the disposal efficiency is very low. But that's also complemented by how good on the ground they were. So very good ball-winning team. Just don't dispose of the ball that much. But again, when you're a high meterage team, you tend to take less disposals because, you're getting more out of them. Defense, however, is very much of a mixed bag. It's very hard to really pinpoint. So for goals against, they're 12.1 against, which is 11th in the league, so not that great for a top team. Goals per inside 50, 23.1, which is 7th in the league, so you're seeing a bit of mediocrity there. Their set shots per inside 50, they're good at preventing. 42.8 percentage their opponents are able to get. And the shots per inside 50, 46.5, and they're both tied 4th. And the defensive one-on-ones loss rate, 24.3, which is tied 6th. So they're not losing that many contests. Defensive one-on-ones, they don't rely on them too much, but it's still healthy. Healthy? There's still a bit of them. 10.2, 10th in the league. So they've got a defense, even though they don't have the fastest, they're not getting beat one-on-one out the contest. Helps with the turnover differential. But there we be. Opposition score from stoppages, however, was fairly high, 35.5. Opposition score off back half, 33.2. So that movement against them sort of hurts. And again, not being a high disposal team and having that disposal differential loss means that their opponents are still converting okay out of them.
Okay. Yep.
In terms of pure score, and the opposition for a 50 ground ball gets, again, very mediocre, 15.3, 11th in the league. I almost going to put the red on it, but decided not to. So as you can see, absolutely fantastic offense, brilliant ball movement, but when the opponent gets the ball, they do tend to let the opponent score easily. So that's probably the one big thing against them.
And you look at as we transition to their ins and outs, you look at who they've gained, and some of the players that they've picked up in the draft are known defensive players. That also hopefully helps solidify those defensive stats that they're lacking up. That they're lacking with.
Yeah, and by memory, it was definitely Jay Polkinghorn. That was the defensive one. And I think one of Mollier and Hoffman too. I know they're very low draft picks, but I mean, you and I know a low Geelong draft pick is like a second rounder for most teams. So.
And it's again, sorry, as I mentioned before, like Lawson Humphreys, like he was a low draft pick, and look at how he's performed already in his first season. It's crazy what Geelong can find in the crop of players.
But not only that, they've boosted their offensive talents.
Absolutely, they
Bailey
have.
Smith and Jack Martin. So already the highest scoring offense in the league, and two players that are offensively focused. It's fair to say, even if they do put some of those players in defense, they're definitely looking to win due to their offensive-based football.
Yeah, 100%.
No doubt about it.
Bailey Smith, especially, like when he was on at the Doggies, everyone saw how brilliant of a player he is. Obviously, he's had that 12 months / maybe 18 months where he's kind of been going through some stuff. Wasn't able to get on the park, partially due to injury, partially due to some other things. But he's definitely a player that is going to fit really well into Geelong's structure. Jack Martin as well.
Yeah.
Might not be in their best 22 just due to how strong their list already is. Could end up being best 25, maybe a fringe player, which it isn't great when he was best 22 at Carlton. However, he wanted out. Carlton didn't really want him. So I think definitely a good depth player, if not best 22 for Jack Martin.
Yeah, and we'll talk about her in a bit more, but polishing off the draft picks, Kyton Matafai Forbes, pick 69, Xavier Ivizic from the rookie draft, Joe Pike, and Patrick Retschke from the rookie drafts as well. And delisted a lot of players that I'd never really heard of: Phoenix Foster, Joe Furphy, Mitch Jardy, Emerson Jaker, and Oscar Murdoch, and James Willis. I don't know why I put him last. But the obviously two big ones were Brandon Parfitt and Gary Rowan. Decided not to pursue a contract. Both of them wanted to play, but sort of fell out of favour. And both are playing in the state leagues, so they might get a pickup in the mid-season draft. Who knows? Brandon Parfitt, obviously a lot more likely. And
yes,
retiring. Zach Tui and Tomahawk.
Yes.
So two really big keys.
With Tui ending his career as the Irish player with the most games played in the AFL, having taken over the Jim Steins record. Tom Hawkins being one of the best leading goal kickers in the competition, finished with a very solid record. I think he's in the top 10. Might even pushing top 5 prior to his retirement off the top of my head. So I know he's definitely like way up there, especially in terms of like goal kickers of the modern game. If we go back 20, 30 years, maybe not as much, because when full forwards were like a much bigger threat in the older games, players like the Chief, for example, they would just absolutely dominate forward. But for the modern game, Tomahawk, definitely one of the best full forwards. And just a quick note on Parfitt and Rowan again. We know that Rowan had a major injury, which took him out of most of last season, and that's probably why Geelong didn't want to renew his contract. But which is understandable, especially because of his age as well. There was no guarantee that we're going to get much out of him in 2025.
Sad but understandable.
Yeah, it's very, very unlucky. Hopefully, he does get picked up. Maybe just as a mid-season pickup. Maybe just for one final year. Give him a farewell game at the very least.
Oh, if a player gets in, if they're like a team with shallow wing depth, lose players, and finals contenders, why not pick up someone like Gary Rowan?
Especially someone who's that experienced. Like,
yeah,
you don't really. He definitely. I feel like he definitely deserves an official farewell game at the very least. But you know, it's the way the AFL goes sometimes. And then Parfitt, he definitely still has the skills to be able to get picked up somewhere. Maybe he's a fringe player for the most part, but definitely should be a player to look out for via the state leagues.
Yeah, and because I have that WA connection, I know he is going to tear it up with the Perth Demons. They're not the most fleshed out list, so at the WA level, I think he's going to be one of those players that tears it up. Always a bit iffy going back up, but I think he's an AFL quality player, but that will remain to be seen. Anyway, in talking about important players, we're going to go for Geelong. And it's a bit weird, I mentioned, Geelong's midfield isn't as bad as it looks. People tend to overstate that fact. But I think one of the important players is still Tanner Brunn in the midfield. I think consistency is sometimes the issue. And a bit, I guess, with defensive is consistency, because again, they generate a lot of good scoring, but they also concede a lot. So with Tanner Brunn, he's a player originally from GWS, traded to Geelong, but he's always had a fairly low time on ground per game. So they're sort of looking after him, but he's turning 24, 25 this year. I think this is where you're looking to where he starts to put in the yards from the off-season, building his tank. As long as been doing that, he'll increase his time played, and I think Geelong looks a bit better in the midfield with him, because you saw flashes last year, like some games even, despite not even playing a lot, he looked to be one of their better players.
Yeah, 100%.
Like, I know they had Jack Bowes who sort of filled in that gap. I thought Tanner Brunn looked a bit better than Bowes. But, as I said, they're sort of working him into it. It's sometimes hard, because you forget, although the outside role is very much more running, in terms of, like, full body, being an inside midfielder is tough. You're in a lot of close, congested plays. You need a bit of muscle on you. And you still need a fair bit of tank, because you're still running a hell of a lot. So Tanner Brunn, there's definitely a player where you can see him get a full game. Again, if Dangerfield gets an injury, Tanner Brunn is the player that's sort of lifting up, while players, they get the harder players like Rory Atkins, or even a Cam Guthrie if he comes in. I feel like I'm missing someone obvious, but it doesn't matter. So that's Tanner Brunn. Going to the outside now, Ollie Dempsey as a winger, as a high half forward. With a lot of play coming from that back half, you need solid wingers to be able to keep that transitive play pressure on your opponents. And Dempsey did absolutely that in his breakout year. He was great, but I think there is a lot of pressure on for him to repeat, because, as I said, Geelong have defensive flaws, so they need their offense to be on point.
They do.
And when you look at their depth, they've lost Tui and Rowan. I know Tui played a lot of areas, some in defense, some up forward. Probably similar to Dempsey, sort of settled for like a high half forward wing role. And Gary Rowan. So they've both left. It leaves in little support. You maybe think like a Cam Guthrie. He takes a bit of wing position at times, goes in the inside midfield if he's best 22 next year. Jai Clark, bit of a ish player at the moment. Here's another winger. But Ollie Dempsey, he's really the standout player, to sort of generate a lot of that wing. So if he can be that offensive wing player, they just need a plug-and-play transition stopper wing on the other side of things, and they're pretty set. Sam de Koning, very interesting player. I don't know. I thought there'd be a bit more discussion on him, really, because it's been a bit of a. Because when you look at his stats, and a lot of Geelong players will know because it was in their premiership year, Sam de Koning as a rookie was insanely good. He was such a solid intercept defender, one-on-one killer, despite being a rookie. Looked to be like, going into one of the best key defenders in the year.
Mm-hmm.
And despite his increase in possessions every year, he hasn't actually improved on many metrics since then. I don't think that's a bit of a problem. Maybe his breakout year was, I wouldn't say a fluke, but you know what I mean? Sometimes you have a form year and sometimes there's no reason that can't be your first. But this year, arguably his best role was filling in for Reece Stanley in the ruck. So as a young defender, not going to put the pressure on him. But with Tom Stewart getting tagged last season, I think Scott should really adjust the offense because if Stewart does go forward, that does expose a player like Sam de Koning. It's like the one big flaw from that plan. They had to do it last year because it got Stewart into the game. He still runs the engine room, but with a bit of time, I think they need to tinker around a bit so Sam de Koning can grow as a defender.
Yeah, agreed.
I think at the moment he's not quite there in the one-on-ones. He gets beat a bit too much. And talking about that, going to the other end of the ground, we're going to the deep forwards. Obviously, a bit of this I've put them because they're obviously sort of covering from Tomahawk. Two absolutely great forward targets. One hulking but a surprisingly athletic presence in Shannon Neal, and the other an athletic but solidly contested forward target in Ollie Henry. Obviously, Ollie Henry isn't really a key forward, but sort of plays like one.
He does.
So, although the offense is definitely run through Cameron, again, involved in a league-high 31% of their team's scoring chains. I would like to see a few more targets to Ollie Henry and Shannon Neal just for the future, make sure it's on track, and not put so much pressure on Cameron because, again, as good as their offense is, what if Cameron does get injured? It doesn't even need to be a big patch of games. It could be like a 5-game out.
Yeah.
And when you lose that, it's looking a bit iffy. So I'd like to see those players develop. I think it's very important. Not so much for next year. I think they're already pretty set for next year. But for even further, for those two to get involved. Because they've got talent. We've seen it. It's just about incorporating it into more plays for next year.
Absolutely. All
right. Going to the new faces, and we'll briefly touch on this because you did mention a lot about Bailey Smith.
Indeed, I did.
But one thing I will say to highlight is that right now he's an inside midfielder who, at the Bulldogs, sort of rotated a lot in the high half forward role and inside midfield, and it's taken a year off. So even though I think he's really good for the team, and I think he will try and establish himself as a premiership midfielder. A premier midfielder.
Yep.
Obviously wants a premiership as well, but we'll see about that. I imagine that his midfield minutes for the first year might be a bit spread out. So again, it's how he transitions. But if he does go into that inside midfield, even if it's for bits, they really want that contested, hard midfielder. They're already a meters gained offense, so Bailey Smith's disposal rate isn't really something to be worried about. Probably the biggest knock on his game, but they're set up for that sort of stuff. So that's not going to worry him. Seems a good fit. Great inclusion. You can see why they're hyped about it. And a little one on Jack Martin. You kind of forget, due to his talent, and being off the park, that he's only just entering his 30s. So while I don't think it's best 22, again, you sort of mentioned it, he's sort of that fringe player. If a player goes down, like a Tyson Stengel, Braden Close, what's the other one? Oh, Brad Close, sorry. Graham Myers.
Yeah.
Jack Martin comes in, not so much about the distribution. he can actually distribute okay, but I think really if he comes in, gets a couple of goals, goal per match average, that's all you want from him. Keep that offense going because, as we said, they are really all in on their offense. And that's where we go for the reasons for optimism. And the first thing is they're a consistent side, freakishly good in the regular season.
Indeed.
Despite their age tag attached to their premiership, they've injected some fresh youth into the squad, and they're sort of they've evened themselves out of it. They're out of the top three, I should say, of average age, albeit fourth, and the third most inexperienced per game. So they're still going in like a direction where, they need to turn over some players. So that drop is actually, in context, probably a good thing for them.
Mm-hmm.
But they've still got a lot of experience. So it's not like a huge amount leaving all at one time. And, as I said, they have the spark and the veterans, and arguably one of the best modern coaches in the history of the game. Again, another thing going for them, finally got double digits at Goomba. They are keen for it. And, I joked about them being a bit unlucky with some of their teams they faced. They face a couple with an actual positive record at Goomba. It's still only 6 interstate trips for the year, with only 2 of those happening in the back half of the year. Geelong can storm home strong this year, just like they did last year. Sorry about that.
Very good.
And yeah, they're recruiting, as I mentioned before, absolutely fantastic. If anyone can get the most out of Bailey Smith, I think Geelong's the one to do it. And even though they have a swarm of mid-round picks, a lot of the teams you go meh, but the Cats, again, they only need a bit of paper covering, a bit of defense improvement.
Yeah.
A bit more solidarity in the midfield, a bit more defensive structure. To really be solid. So, more than solid, to be like really deep, maybe win the premiership level.
Yeah, 100%.
So yeah, not too surprising there. But we'll try the reasons for pessimism. I will say they didn't have to go too much in their depth last year. They only played 35 players for the year. And to put that in Blaze focus, I think that's 12. Oh, was it 12? Maybe it's like, I think it was like 45, 46 for Richmond.
Yeah, there was like only 2 or 3 players on our entire list that didn't get played, and that was because they were already injured and couldn't play.
Yeah, so they didn't break into their depth too much, but with some of the players that they played, they looked a bit raw. And I know this is still investing in the future. They don't want to like completely, that's why you haven't seen their drop off, because they're very bold in investing in young players.
Mm-hmm.
But players like Mullen, O'Sullivan, who played one game but got beaten, Sam Closey, and Toby Conway, they're all players that need a bit more development, you would think. And I think that's going to take a couple more years. So, you lose a few veterans. You're still in a bit of danger, especially considering how much you rely on players like Dangerfield and Cameron.
Yeah.
You're still in a bit of danger if you do have a bad injury year. And in 2 years, I also want to say, talking about their structure and performances, they've gone from committing the least amount of turnovers in games to the team that, utilizes the most handball chains. Going from a team that utilized handball chains to a more direct dump kick approach.
Yeah.
So this is clearly not the same team as their early 2020s run, and there may be a bit more consistency issues. We saw it a bit last year, so maybe this is, maybe they do better this year, but maybe this was like a bit of the upswing as they're sort of figuring it out still.
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of still don't know exactly where this Nearcat style is. We know it's aggressive, but it's still a bit iffy to know if it's, if it's going to be a powerhouse team while playing a different style.
Yeah, 100%.
And again, going a bit further into it, their defense is also not what it used to be. Like, no qualms about it. Like, they've made no notable changes in that line this year. They're going to have to rely on growth in the back player. And really, I think he's a very underrated player for Geelong. Jack Henry. He's the only reliable one-on-one defender they have. Jay Kolodajny, he's getting a bit iffy. As I mentioned, Tommy Stewart, he's had to push up a bit. Sam De Koning, I mentioned, gets beaten a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So really, I think it's a bit one-dimensional, and I think it shows in them being exposed. So I think they got to support a player like Jack Henry, who is doing his job. Very solid down back.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as I said, I think it's just a bit. They need a bit more structure in defense. They need to go back a bit too much to their roots, but again, they have to realize that they're a very frail team.
Yes.
So, when things aren't going that way, we've seen a few times when it hasn't happened offensively, them absolutely looking out of it. So, if they're going to be consistent, they sort of have to get back in, work on their defensive transition and, just defense from set play, really.
100%. That's exactly pretty much the key area that they need to work on. That even if some of the stats are very positive for them, it's the bit it's part of where they're struggling the most, as we touched on in the stats, and that's if they're not really building anything towards improving in that area, then it's gonna hurt them a little bit in the long run for this season.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're getting into Psyrick's verdict, and I might be a bit controversial here, but despite all I said about the defense, I legitimately believe that Geelong will be one of the best regular season teams of next year. I think if offensive ball movement is still the way to win games in 2025, I think it's just a case where, they might lose a couple of bad games like Sydney did last year.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at their list, you look at the teams around them, like they're the team that's already doing really well. They've got some room for growth, and they haven't lost too much. I know Zach Tui on the wing's a bit of a loss, and Rowan is, but in terms of what other players, they're not replacing a key forward with players that they haven't already sort of, tested.
Yeah.
They've already proved that they can play without Tom Hawkins. And, so I feel that they're going to be a top 4 lock. First to fourth, and I'm going to put them at minor premiers. I just feel it's going to be another close one. I reckon, I don't even know if they're going to make that deep run in finals. Like, I could see them being like, very frail, but in the regular season, they've got a really solid game plan. We know where most of their players lie, and, they've still got some room for growth. So, that if we don't see, especially, with that run at Goomba, we might not see that dip that put them at, third last year. Like extra games at Goomba, that's easily another couple of wins. So
yeah, absolutely.
I reckon that's about that range. They're your minor premiers, according to me. We'll do a little rundown at the end, but Geelong, number 1, ahead of Brisbane, who are number 2. So still 2 more teams to go in that top 4, according to my ladder. Blazy might be different. He might not see Geelong as the best team. We'll find out at the end of the analysis.
I will say now that I definitely see Geelong as a top 8 lock at minimum. Whether top 2, that's up for debate, but they're definitely punching top 4.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where I will tease my section of the ladder, which I will reveal on the very last episode of our preseason analyses. But for now, let's move on to the team that's a little bit further north, maybe a little more in that enjoy warmer weather and sunshine, and that is the Gold Coast Suns, of course.
Yeah. North on position, but will they head north onto the ladder? That is the big question, Blazy, as they try and get, again, for the 13th year in a row, their first finals appearance.
Well, one can only hope that they actually have a better record than they did last season, where they were only able to win at home and they were not able to win whilst traveling up until the second half of the season.
So I've got the stats for it just to wrap up. 8 out of 10 games they had at People's First Stadium and won. And they also had 2 wins at TIO Stadium, which is essentially their second home.
Pretty much.
The flip side of that is they only won 2 games away, and they were against the Tigers and the Bombers. So, well, Bombers, we've said about the Bombers, they're, it's still a decent win, but it's not like they beat like a top 8 team or anything like that. So
no, and at the time it was like at the end of the season anyway, where the Bombers had lost their edge, and
sort of the Essendon edge,
and then the Suns were also kind of in that position where they weren't going to make finals at that point. They were just trying to play for pride and consistency, trying to come into 2025.
Yeah. So again, to wrap up the good things for the Suns, they did get wins against the Crows, the Hawks, the Cats, and the Dons. I say Crows because I think it was at the last half of the season when they were looking better.
They beat them round 1.
Oh no, it wasn't. It was the early.
Yeah, it was round 1.
That's right. I don't know why I put the Crows on there, but I mean, it's still a win. Whoops, I'm reading Geelong's one. Anyway, but on the flip side, the bad losses were really the Kangaroos and the Eagles away. Like, they really needed to win those games. It was a bit of a gimme. We'll talk about a bit later. Their fixture definitely suggested that they could have could have been in the 8, especially if they won those 2 games, 13 and 12. They'd been just finishing outside the 8, but instead they finished 11 and 12, a couple games outside the 8, and a couple of games and 7% up from their 2023 showing. So in Denver's first year, at least you can say there was improvement.
There's a steady improvement,
undeniably. Yeah. So we go into the stats. The first page of the stats.
And honestly, just from first glance on my perspective, it doesn't look all that bad.
Yeah. The worst thing was the offense.
Oh, 100%.
I'm not going to lie. Their offensive conversion was pitiful. They did not, with their metrics, they should have been getting more than 10th in sort of goals produced. Again, 12.2 goals per match, but with the 3rd highest inside 50s, 56.1. And you ask, were they inaccurate? And it's not bad. Like 50% in modern era, it's okay. It's around average.
Yeah.
But what was poor for them, their marking inside 50 and their ability to generate shots. Their mark inside 50 rate, 10.6, 15th. 18.9% marks inside 50 rate, so only 18% for any inside 50 to be a mark, which was last. Mark inside 50s were 10.6 a game, I should say, at 15.
Correct.
Goals per inside 50, 21.8 at 15. So, again, 21.8% to get a goal per inside 50. Same with the set shots, 40.3 to generate a set shot at 17th. And shots per inside 50, 43.6 at 16th. And although points off turnovers is a very good thing, like I'm not saying this is bad that they're 3rd in the league at 52.4 in the game, it sort of shows the only way that they could get points this year. So they were able to generate the most opposition turnovers at 71.4, which is 1st in the league. And that generated in a higher offensive 1% win rate at 28.3. So again, you get a lot of those 1-on-1 wins when you're a bit exposed, when you got a player off the back foot. So, and they had a lot of targets because of that. So they had the second most amount of targets at 12.3 per game. So this was a team that relied on the opposition getting the ball off opposition players to generate their score. And I'm going to tell you why a bit later, why that's a bit of a concern for them. But it does mean that their midfield were doing stuff. So their clearances, a bit mid. But in terms of their midfield structure, they were shaping up good. They weren't allowing... they were putting a lot of pressure to generate turnovers. again from that midfield.
Mhm.
Post clearances, contested possession, so either handballs to them or turnovers from the opposition from the clearances. 85.2, fifth. Post clearance ground ball gets, so knock-ons that clear the pack, all that sort of stuff. 62, third. Meters per disposal, one of the highest in the lead. 16.7 at second. They didn't get much of the ball, however. A bit like Fremantle. Was Fremantle? No. Geelong, I should say. Disposal differential, 13.7, a loss. 13th in the league. Meters gain differential, a loss of 51.2, which is the 10th in the league.
Mm-hmm.
A mark differential of 7.5, so outmarked by the opponents, 15th in the league. And they didn't generate a lot of marks on lead compared to their opponents. It was a 2.6 loss, tied first in the league. So what this sort of tells you, they're great structured around the ball, but they're heavily focused on clearances.
Yep.
And again, that aggressiveness with the turnovers, it does get them a lot of score and a lot of turnovers. But with that aggressiveness, it still allows their opposition to get marks. They're not locking down the opponents per se, but they're taking those aggressive options to try and generate a turnover.
And a lot of that comes from, as we talked about all season long, is that they're like their key three players in that midfield, being Flanders, Rowell, and the third one that I'm forgetting.
Anderson.
Thank you.
And Doug Miller as well.
When he wasn't injured.
When he was playing.
Yeah. Those key three, especially Matt Rowell, you saw it all season long. He was contested possession ball, tackling ball, clearance ball. He was doing all of that major heavy work through that midfield. And that's why their post clearance rates are up so high, but everything else is still so low.
Yeah, exactly. Because, if you're getting tackled, all you're trying to do is get the ball out. You're not necessarily focused on where it's going to go. Yeah. So if you've got good tackling pressure in your inside midfielder, it can help with your post clearance work. So, and the other point I want to say is with ball in hand as well, they were a bit dump kicking. Like, it's very hard to see exactly because, a lot of these stats require a bit of context, especially like the differentials and all that, but they weren't the best at moving the ball. And, as I said, I didn't put them in, but they're not that great at points from the back half. So, not surprisingly, they need a bit of movement work, but their inside work's pretty good. But it's very surprising to see, but their best line, and I think it's almost undoubtedly, is their defense. Like, goals against, they were bad. I know it. 14th in the league. But you look at their one-on-one stats, and, as I said, they still had, a lot of turnovers going the other way. As I said, opposition score of turnovers, I put it last, is 49.7. So they had a lot of turnovers going against them, a lot of score generated. But in those defensive one-on-one contests, they were standing pretty solid. And I know it's not always that way. Sometimes they're just positioned that way, if they don't generate a lot of incident marks. But as we know, they have Mac Andrews there, so they're still looking to generate from that back half. Defensive one-on-one loss rate, 21.1. That is the best in the league. The defensive one-on-ones, 11.6, 7th in the league. So not only do they have a good loss rate, as in they prevented loss, they also were tested a fair few times. Opposition shots per inside 50, they generated the least, 45 at first. So oppositions found it hard to get that shot. Set shots per inside 50, 41.6. Oppositions found it hard to get those shots. I think their marks inside 50 was fairly low. It wasn't quite the lowest in the league. I think it was mid, but it was still impressive. Their X score per shot for their opponents, so how hard it was. They're only getting 3.19 per shot, which is 15th in the league. So their shots that their opponents had to get were hard. And their spoils, not surprisingly, when they have such big bodies down there, 33.4, second in the league. So they were fantastic in the air. The only thing I'll say, goes a bit with their small defenders. Inside 50 ground ball gets 16.3, 15th in the league. They're not so great on the ground. But as you can mention, and, when you go through some of the players and the years they had, with the top-end talent of Sam Collins, Bodie Uland having a fantastic year, and Mac Andrews. I think is a bit. He definitely signifies as the offensive aggressiveness of Gold Coast, and while he can get exposed, he does mix in very well with the GWS Gold Coast defense. So it's a really good structure down there. So I think it's their best line. I'm not sure if that's concerning, considering that their midfield has been talked about. They're like, oh, they're going to get better every year. Oh, they're going to be one of the betters in the year. But their defense, which was rabble not too long ago, has now picked up faster than their midfield. So I think it's more interesting. Like, I think their midfield will improve, but that will come with structure. But their defense, keep an eye on them because, surprisingly decent. And as we look in the list changes, they've already got that solid backcore. Who do they ring in? I'll let you lead this off. A couple of really good half-backers.
One of them being a player
close to your heart.
Close to my heart, a player who won our best and fairest in the season that he left. Not to mention the fact that it was out of all the players that had left us in this off-season, he was probably the one that we should have tried to keep the most. And that's Daniel Rioli. Like, premiership small forward, transitioned into halfback when Basher Hooley really struggled to get back onto the park because of his leg injuries. And had just become one of the best halfback players in the competition. His stats were always superb. Like, I think on average, he was at least maybe top 10 in most metrics in regards to other halfback players. And yeah, he's again, it's the Rioli name as well. It's just that sort of magic that the Rioli players have always given the AFL. And now the Gold Coast get one of their own and have to make him work for their backline, which won't be too difficult, as we've already seen in the stats. Their backline is their best part of the team at the moment, just with some little holes that they need to fill with Daniel Rioli. John Noble's kind of the same, will be that easily slot-in player. He's a player that can also play through the midfield and forward as well, but will probably be pushed mostly into that backline to help help fill those defensive holes. Then Elliot Himmelberg, again, also another backline player, fun fact.
Used to be.
Used to be. He was pushed more up forward, wasn't he?
Yeah, last year he sort of fell out of the Crows backline, but was used as a utility forward. And I think that's where he'll stay. Who knows, though?
Actually, yeah, thinking about it, I think that is where he will stay because their forward line needs a lot of work.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Yeah, that's why I was trying to edge you towards that direction. But yeah, from Adelaide, couldn't find his spot in the team. But yeah, do you want to continue on the draft? Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're good. I will keep going. Yeah. So in the draft, they picked up Leo Lombard from the Air Academy team. A very, very exciting prospect player. Cooper Bell, they yoinked from GWS Academy team because GWS, I don't think we're actually looking at him for this season. Max Noble, who came through via the rookie draft, previously at Fremantle. And Asher...
Kind of also yoinked.
True.
Freo wanted to pick him up, but Gold Coast were like, no, if you're going to put him on there, we're going to take him. We need some key forward / ruck depth.
It's like when Hugh Greenwood was put up and the Roos were just like, yoink, we'll take him.
Yeah.
And then Asher...
at least learning from their past.
Yeah, exactly. And then Asher Etham also come in via the rookie draft. Out is a couple of big names. Jack Lukosius goes to Port Adelaide. So does Rory Atkins. That was a part of a big three-way trade with another team. Was it Collingwood? It was Collingwood, right?
Collingwood and Richmond.
Yes. Oh, yeah, we got some picks out of it. It was great because of also the Daniel Rioli thing. Retired was Levi Casbolt and Brandon Ellis. Saw both of those coming, to be honest. Ellis had started pushing into his 30s, and whilst he definitely could still play, he achieved what he wanted to do in the AFL with Richmond, and then for the Gold Coast, he just went there to solidify a future post-football. And definitely when Dimmer came in, that definitely helped in that regard as well, because that's something they had talked about when he was originally signed at Richmond. And then Levi Casbolt has a long history with both Carlton and now the Suns. Here and there in terms of a decent forward player. injured for a lot of his time up at the Suns. But
Always a better mark than a goal kicker.
definitely. Honestly,
Reliable, surprisingly, at the end.
when we were looking at like the 2018-2019 era, when we needed a new full forward before we picked up Tom Lynch, I was actually kind of heavily leaning towards maybe getting Casbolt because I knew he was a great mark.
Yeah.
It was just about...
And again, Colin were looking at delisting him. I
they
think
were.
he was actually off a list when he got picked up, so...
He was. And yeah, it was just, his goal kicking craft that just needed to kind of work on, which didn't really happen all that well or all that much. Especially when they got Ben King up there as well. It definitely kind of made it a little bit more difficult to try and fit him in, even when he was healthy.
Exactly.
And then delisted, which is actually quite a big list for them. Dimo definitely putting in a lot of work in terms of trying to cultivate this list now. Sandy Brock, Sam Day, who's now gone up to Brisbane, was signed post delisting, I believe. Oscar Folkhead, Darcy McPherson, Jack Mahoney, Huego Owe, I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced, I don't know. Will Rowland, and James Sitsis.
Yeah. I should say, a couple of interesting ones, because obviously you got a lot of young players, but also Darcy McPherson, probably age 26, never quite found his place as a midfield forward. And Jack Mahoney, which wasn't the Kangaroos player that was tipped to be pretty good, but sort of just fell out, wasn't it?
Might have been. I'll have a look.
It's like what? 23 years of age. Fairly high recruit from North Melbourne, just sort of 34th in the league. So
correct. He was originally from North Melbourne.
Yeah, so lost a bit of depth there. A lot of places, but when you look at what they gained, you can see some areas that should be a bit of an improvement next year. And I have listed for you, like I've been doing all these, should come from no as a surprise. Some players I think that can do that. And we're going to start with Ben Ainsworth as a small forward. And I think he's been growing in usefulness in the Suns forward line. He signed a long-term contract. But this year, I'm not saying that he was one-dimensional. It's just that the Suns forward line was one-dimensional.
Absolutely.
And it's one of those things where it annoys me so much when I see, because I know some good people doing some stats write-ups, but whenever I see the Suns, I see King and Ben Long listed as playing a small forward role. And, a bit under in some of his stats. But when you look at it, it was really King and Long playing key forwards.
Yes.
He was just playing above his height, And I think really when you look at it that way, because, Long's crumbing, it was okay, but it wasn't as high as some of the other key forwards. So one thing they were lacking is diversity in that forward line, especially from the small and, medium-ish forwards. I still view Lukosius as a key forward, but they didn't get him involved. So if they can link up, if their link up improves, if they can hit the targets, I think Ben Ainsworth is really someone who can benefit from that, because he only had 16 goals last year. I reckon he can have a 30-goal season next year, because normally a good converter wasn't targeted that much, but he's got a lot of qualities that I like, and he's growing in age, and I'm pretty sure the Suns rate him fairly well as well. So keep an eye on Ben Ainsworth. Now, again to the backyard again. We're talking about a player that I thought was really good down back, Charlie Ballard, the other defender I sort of forgot to mention before. I forgot him, but I put him as an important player, so figure that one out. But, the one knock on him is a very mediocre ball user. So why I think is really important is because he can now have Noble and Rioli to link up with. So if he's able to get that intercept, he likes getting a few intercepts, or even if he just spoils, to have those players like Noble and Rioli, especially Rioli, he's good on the ground. He's not relying so much on making he doesn't have to take the 100% best play. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, he can just knock the ball to ground if he can trust his smaller defenders now to get the job done, or, as I said, if he trusts like the player up the chain to not turn the ball over, which they have been doing, he can just give it a little rinky-dink handball off. You know, he doesn't have to feel like to take the long down the line option. I'm not saying that he always does that, but you know what I mean? It's just those small changes that make a football team better, because it's, you know, it's the one better change resulting in better changes down the line.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of that actually starts with Charlie Ballard, even though you might not think of him too much. And, you know, still by far just the third best key defenders, but you see when teams get better, sometimes it's the third one in the chain that makes the lift, you know?
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
only as good as your weakest link. And I'm not even saying Charlie Ballard is weak. I thought he had a great year last year, but say small improvements. Anyway, Jack Witts, sideline for 2024 a bit, but he is really the glue that holds the Suns together, especially as Moyle taking the time to develop. He was involved in a lot of Suns scoring chain without actually scoring himself also option. So he's very important in the middle. I compared him to Brady Grundy, and for his age, he's still very good around the ground.
Yes.
So, you know, as it's a pretty obvious choice, but, you know, he's really, you know, often not underrated, but, you know, because he's like the third or fourth best ruckman in the year, and you only really think about the top two spots, sort of goes under the radar, but definitely deserves his dues because he is absolutely fantastic for the Gold Coast midfield.
Absolutely.
Going on to the inside midfield, and there's not too much to choose from. Gold Coast, again, outside of the big ones, you know, in your Rao, Anderson,
Flanders and Miller.
Miller. Well, even Flanders, like, he should really be playing on the half back line with his distribution last year. I'm not saying so much this year because it got more people.
Yeah.
I could definitely see that pure shift into the mid. But last year, he probably didn't need to be in that midfield. But they had no one around. So a player like Alex Davies, he's got a big body. He's been asked to work on his tank. He should be doing that. But to me, I think he's got the player with the highest potential to actually enter that inside midfield. His clearance work was okay when we saw him last year. Tackling pressure is very good. So a player like Rao, if he goes in there, Rao can be an offensive-based midfielder. And we saw that mid to forward connection was poor. So if you get such a quality player like Rao doing that, instead of the defensive work, you know, where they don't need that as much because they're already a solid defense.
Mm-hmm.
So you're pushing the chains more to where you need them. I reckon Alex Davis can do that. You know, he might not be leading the inside mid, but he might be filling those roles to allow their offensive more players to have more impact. And finally, Jed Walters. I know didn't have much of a preseason last year. I'm not going to hate on him for his first season. Sort of similar to Aaron Cadman last year. He just is more just the team he's in.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, they need a solid key forward option that isn't Ben King. And he doesn't need to improve much, but he just needs to be less of a liability because he was for much of 2024. Like, there's no doubts you're sacrificing goals per game by playing someone like Jed Walters.
100%.
In that year. But for the long term, they just need improvements, and they need that improvement to happen next year because they're going to keep playing him, no doubt in my mind. But they just can't be so reliant on Long, who was already a bit of a fringe player. I'm surprised his last year was that good. Like, it sort of didn't really come from anywhere. And Ben King, who, you know, as I said, he's really good, but he's just asked so much.
It's
not like
and because of how much it's kind of mounted on his shoulders as the number one forward, it's why he's been so inconsistent.
Exactly. You know, he can rack up good games, but then normally against the lesser teams, he struggles when he gets a lot of attention on him, and there's just no one to take that attention away. So, you know, as I said, it's a big ask, but I don't really see where they're going to get that from for any other player. So for me, you know, and it may be who we're talking about in the new phases in Elliot Himmelberg that takes a bit away. But no doubt, they're really going to be hoping it's Walters that takes the reins. You know, Himmelberg's just there for diversity, you know, for a bit of a backup, you know. So, going on to new faces, again, we'll briefly touch through it. We sort of talked about it before, but I want to say, like, how much I know it's a lot about the halfback, and I mentioned Rioli's other traits because he's been everywhere. But what I like about this dual piece in the halfback line is, again, you got Daniel Rioli on the ground player. He's so good.
He's
Like, one of the best abilities is to win the ball off the ground. He goes a bit in and out in terms of disposal in getting the ball into his hands, but as a defender on the ground, it's so underrated how much he's just winning contests. And you win that, not only you're getting the disposal, you're preventing more opposition scoring, which again, something that Gold Coast needs to focus on in pure terms of from the ground.
Yeah.
So you got that. And then you got Johnny Noble, who, as I said, a bit of an iffy 2024. But when you look at the type of piece he is an aggressive user of the ball at a pretty decent use rate. For how long he likes to kick the ball. And he still generates turnovers. That's going to be a part of the Suns game anyway. But with Powell, I think that, they've got a lot of diversity on a halfback now. And again, Sam Closey on the wing had an absolutely fantastic 2024 season. If you see him develop a bit, now you've got a bit of line on the outside, So you got Danny Rioli. He's sort of that more central player. He can, link up the ball, generate switches and all that. And then you got players like Johnny Noble who can break the line a bit. Powell who can send a long ball. So they're now turning into a multifaceted movement team, as well as having that diversity down back.
Yeah.
And I've sort of mentioned Elliot Himmelberg as well before, so I think that's all I've got to say about that.
No, that's very good, very comprehensive, and it's exactly what the Suns need. And well, again, just Daniel Rioli in general was something that the Suns needed. Now they have him, so
yeah. So we're going to go into the reasons for optimism. And, I mentioned a bit before, they did have a bit of improvement last year. Like, I know it's not too much on the ladder, but if you look at their stats, and one of the stats I mentioned before were meters against, and you might look at that and say that, a meters loss differential of 51.2 is bad. But under Stewie Doo, they were having like meter losses of in the hundreds, You had a season, I think it was like 360 something.
Mm-hmm.
I think one year they lost the league at like 2018, and they had that very mixed league. I'm going to check it now. I really think it was like negative 500.
It was
negative 786. Negative 748.6 meters against.
That's so crazy.
Yeah. Wasn't even worse in the league. It was actually Carlton that year. So, it shows where those teams were at the time. But, so this is a team that went from pretty putrid differential stats. And that's the biggest knock about the Gold Coast is they never get their game on their own terms because they give too much to their opponents.
Yeah.
But it is getting better. And that's a good thing. And their defense, like Adelaide, easiest comparison to make, is probably their best line considering how much ahead of the ground sort of lets them down in some areas. And they've added to it with the two distributors that we talked about before. So we're going to see opponents score a bit less from their forward half, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to see less ground balls. It's the only bit that they have to improve on. And then very clear progress towards that. And finally, their forward line is so very young. And it means that the room for growth is very high. And it only takes a couple of players because, they're still generating inside 50s. And I know they're not quality. But if they can just generate a bit more, if they can find a player that generates a bit of, plays out of nowhere. I know they shouldn't rely on it, but they're going to have to find it. Like a player that just finds a way to win that ball, kicks the goal, from the ground. All of a sudden, they get like maybe 20 goals more next season. And they're looking like a team that's above 100% in percentage because they weren't that far off. I think it was like 98.9 this season.
Something like that.
So they're almost there. So next season, I think, and going into the pessimism and, predictions, I'm not I don't see their growth too big. I think that's the key metric that they're going to have to get. Over 100% in percentage and continue that growth in some of the differential areas. But we'll go into the pessimism. And I will say, as good as some of the metrics were for Gold Coast, you do have to realize that only one team this year got to play all three statistical dregs of the AFL. And when I say that, I mean, when you look at the stats, it's pretty clear that North, West Coast, and Richmond were so far behind the league in terms of, offense generated, getting possessions, yada, yada, yada. And they got to play all of those teams twice. They still didn't make the 8. They were 13th on the ladder and 20% away from finals.
Yeah.
So they're arguably the easiest fixture, and they still weren't near it, which is concerning. Because next year they're not going to get North, West Coast and Richmond. I think they've got like an Adelaide-Melbourne doubleheader. With,
they have a much
a bit of
harder
from
schedule than what they got given.
Yeah, so it is a bit concerning. I still think they'll get improvements, but, to say that they'll definitely make the top 8 next year, I think's a bit up in the air. Again, with such a young list, in certain lines, like so much their defense. The defense is actually getting a bit older now. Obviously helps with Sam Collins, but still a bit of youth. Again, Powell's not that old. Mac Andrews not that old. Bodie Ulan's young. So, they've got a young forward line. They've got a young back line. It's what I mentioned before. Their midfield, I don't want to say it, but it almost feels like they're old enough to know better when you look at some of their stats. And, and that comes with the fact that, again, I believe that it's a bit of a structural problem, but it is their worst line in context. You know what I mean? In terms of the players they have, in terms of their average age, they are the biggest underperforming line. And with no list changes, they're going to be playing a similar line like we saw, and there's no guarantee that their midfield stats will actually improve next year, which is a scary thought. Because, as I said, they've got so much room for growth, but really, again, underlying, they're gonna have to have a season where they start, like they've never had a positive differential in terms of meters gained. They've lost every season in terms of that. They've never once out-metered their opponents. And as I said, there's no guarantee that they'll have next year, so made that sound a bit concerning, but as I said, I don't want to get too down on them. But as I said, a bit, and goes into next position point is that there's so many areas in terms of differential stats, and I'm going to highlight on the next page how comprehensive it is. And you're going to need across the board improvement for these stats to improve, because I've sort of referenced site called FootyWire. They do a lot of like the rankings, and you look at the high rankings versus their low rankings, and you see a lot of the team versus opponent stats. They get less kicks, they get less disposals, they get less marks per game. Obviously, points per game is a pretty big one. Goal assists per game, clearances per game, clangers per game, and rebound 50s per game. All of them are lesser than what their opponents are able to get. And, as I said, combined to where they're like, pretty low in a lot of pure stats, not that high in a lot of, high stats. It's a lot to make up, And as I said, they've only really improved in their ball movement. I think some of that will actually get a flow-on effect. I think some of that will put them to at least mediocre in a lot of lines. But mediocre doesn't see them getting finals, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And I'll say that in their outlook. I do like the direction Gold Coast are going. I think under Dimmer you can see the improvements, but there's just too many deficits. And what I'm afraid for Gold Coast is they're always going to be a team that looks better next year to the current season they're playing. Because I said last year, I thought a bit of growth, and we're looking for finals next year in 2025. And now I'm saying they're not even around that park. So for me, I predict them to finish 10 to 15th. I'm going to put them as a final miss lock, and my gut feel is 13th. And I don't want to be too down on them. I can actually see where their list is heading because, again, 2018, they looked hopeless. You know, in terms of list management, in terms of what they were doing on and off the field. I can see the improvement, but I just don't think it's going to happen as fast as some people are hoping. And I definitely think that midfield is definitely not tracking to where they would want it to be. So they're either going to have to look at other areas for improvement or they're going to have to make some changes.
Mhm.
And that comes with a few big calls. So it'll be interesting to see what Dimmer tries to make, you know, because he could make a few big changes. He's not afraid of that. You know, he's a player that likes to muck around a bit with player positioning. So you might, you know, if he does a few things and pulls it off, maybe he does get in the 8. But realistically, it's sort of hard to see that happening for me.
No, 100% agree. And again, and it's predominantly because of that forward line. There's just so much inconsistency. There's so much not guaranteed that like you can't really tell just even from first glances, even just from even watching their gameplay, that it's gonna even make up for anything worthwhile this season. There's still so many pieces that we feel like are missing, or players that just we don't think are going to be able to step up when they need to kind of solidify them as a possible finalist.
Yeah. And as I said, I could see some of those things again with 10th. Like, I'm looking at a season where maybe they make a slight change in the midfield and their productivity goes up. But at the end of the day, they're still kicking to a Jed Walters forward line, maybe an Elliot Himmelberg forward line. Like, that's a big leap. Ben King, he's done as much as he can. I can't see his stats improving that much. You know what I mean? Like, I reckon, considering the bulk, he's actually like not done too bad. Same with
He's
Ben
been
Longs.
serviceable. It's just not consistent enough.
Yeah, he's been missing a lot, but you know, it's just a lot of pressure to put on a young kid.
Yeah, it is.
Like when you're a key forward and you're like, if I'm not getting a goal, it's very hard for me to see us getting goals. So you know what I mean? Like, and again, unless there's a lift in goal production, and again, I think it's enough to get him 10th. But again, I still think, you know, with their opposition still getting a lot of the ball, you know, I still think a lot of the top teams are going to snuff him out. You know what I mean? But there's still some higher level improvement. And I just want to say that because it does sound like I'm being very harsh on them. I can be harsh on the Suns, not gonna lie. Like, I haven't liked a lot of what they've done through their history. But to me, this just seems like a season to where the easiness of their fixture last year sort of counteracts the growth that they might have. So they might be around the same. They might have a few better wins. But, you know, as I said, I feel like they really missed an opportunity to overperform last year or this year. Well, last year, technically. 2024. So, yeah, that's where I have them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
To wrap it all off for the Spotify listeners, because we're finishing all the team analysis this week, we got first Geelong Cats, heralded them as the minor premierships this episode. Second, Brisbane Lions. Sixth, Fremantle Dockers. Eighth, Collingwood Magpies. Ninth, the Carlton Blues. 10th, the Adelaide Crows. 13th, the Gold Coast Suns. And 15th, the Essendon Bombers. I know there's a long episode, but I'm just going to ask you a bit of question. You haven't seen my full ladder. So who do you reckon might be on that third or fourth spot in my top 8 Playsy? Who do you reckon I might have put in there?
Oh, that's a tough call. I'm going to be honest with you.
Had a year to read my mind.
I could see you putting a GWS up there just as a kind of like a shot in the dark sort of. They've done fairly well in terms of brief restructuring. Again, Jake Stringer being a big signing. We'll talk about this next week, of course, because they're actually up next on the list. But yeah, Jake Stringer being a really big signing for them in that to help solidify that forward line. They already have a really good midfield. They still have a really strong back line. So you could be putting GWS up there. I could see Port Adelaide obviously going up there with their list improvements. Granted, the loss of Dan Houston definitely doesn't help them, but they've made some solid changes that I think is going to be very beneficial to them. Who else has been really good this offseason? There's definitely a couple. I don't think you'd put Sydney up there. I don't think you would put Hawthorn up there as much as, they've definitely improved upon in the off season with getting Battle and Barras.
Yeah, I think I've made some comments in our general chat about my views on Hawthorn. So
Yeah. So I think
what I
Jitteras and Port Adelaide are probably like the big two that you could possibly put up there. Maybe at least, fifth or seventh as well. But in terms of who else you could put up there, I am genuinely blanking.
Yeah, that's all right. I think that's pretty fair. We'll find out in a few weeks because a lot of those teams, is up next. G is up next, and
Yes.
I don't think S is up next. I think we've got to wait a bit for Sydney.
I believe the next
we'll
one's up next. So let me quickly look. The next ones up next are the Giants, Hawthorn, Melbourne, and North Melbourne.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, a bit of Vic bias in that episode. Hate to see it, but it is what it is.
You say that, but there's definitely a lot of interesting things that we could say, especially about Melbourne and North Melbourne.
Oh yeah, some very interesting teams, and even as I said, North Melbourne, sort of in the same boat as Gold Coast, a team looking for growth with a few flaws. So I'll try and break down where they might see it, where they could improve on from their stats in 2024. But until then, we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah,
because I still got to write it up. I haven't done the write-ups yet.
Yeah, I need to get to work on the Hawthorn one and the North Melbourne one because those are my tasks.
Yeah.
So we have some extra time now to work on them as we recorded this on Saturday, and we're really.
And Blazy will take some charge of some of these because we were like sort of figured it out. We're like, oh yeah, if we need to do this at 4 teams per episode, as you can see, they're fairly long. We need to start doing this week per week before the season starts. So
definitely,
I took the charge to start with. We know the structure now. Blaze is going to take the reins on some of them. I'm obviously going to help him along, but we hope to give you a pretty comprehensive analysis. I know this episode was a bit long, but again, I think we're fairly on point with some of our things. If I do say so myself, I like a good preseason discussion.
Yeah,
all the hopes.
Out of all the conversations that I've kind of seen online in regards to like preseason analysis of the teams, I feel like we're doing a really, really solid job of going very in depth, especially stats wise, which is something that you love, obviously. And I love taking a look at the player side of things, which thankfully you have covered most of already. But
we'll see a few more Blazy players next episode, especially when we get to Richmond.
Oh, even when we get to Hawthorn and North Melbourne, because there's some players on those teams that I do really like, and I'm very much interested in
a good Scrabble score as well.
Very true.
Using the X.
Yes, there is one big man who should have been all Australian last season. I'm still very sour on that. That I will talk about next week. But until then, thank you all so much for coming and hang out and listen to us if you're on YouTube and or Spotify. Again, next week we will cover GWS, Hawthorn, Melbourne, and North Melbourne. It's probably going to be another long episode, so get some popcorn or just have a drink, relax, and enjoy our extremely long and interesting conversations we will have, our breakdowns, because there's going to be a lot to talk about, especially with Melbourne and North Melbourne, as I just said. I think Melbourne especially because of some of the off-season stuff that they are still dealing with. But until then, thank you all so much. Please go check out our socials as per usual. I'm being very active on Twitch just because I enjoy doing it. It's been a lot of fun and I'm having a lot of fun. And we shall see you. Sorry, I'm kind of thought I might have had something else to say, but I don't think I have anything else to say. So I will wrap it up here.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
We'll see you technically next week. For us, it'll be 1.5.
Technically, yes. But again, we're looking forward to it, and I hope you are too. So thank you all again, and we will see you all for episode 44 of the Coast to Coast AFL podcast next week. Catch ya.